the winter solstice approaches. December's longest night when darkness holds dominion for 16 hours, and the boundary between what we know and what we fear grows thin as morning frost. Outside your window, perhaps snow is falling, or rain, or simply the weight of winter settling onto a world that seems to hold its breath, waiting for something it cannot name. You are here now, safe in your space. Maybe you have a warm drink nearby. Perhaps you are wrapped in blankets against the cold. And in your hands what? A phone, a book, a mug. These are just objects, you tell yourself. Inert matter shaped by human hands for human purposes. Dead things that serve the living. But what if I told you that some objects never truly die? That certain relics carry the weight of every hand that touched them, every crime committed in their presence, every curse spoken in their name. What if the boundary between subject and object, between the living and the thing, is not as clear as our rational minds prefer to believe? In our previous exploration of cursed relics, we confined ourselves to England, to screaming skulls in Dorset manors, to bleeding stones in the Cotswolds, to Anne Boleyn's prophetic cockle shell and the severed hands that granted thieves supernatural passage through locked doors. But England holds no monopoly on objects that refuse to remain inert. Tonight, we expand our catalogue beyond British shores. We venture across continents and centuries to document artifacts that prove every culture, every civilization, every corner of humanity has created objects that absorb human intention and refuse to release it. From the Hope Diamond, torn from the eye of a Hindu goddess and stained with the blood of French royalty, to the Crying Boy paintings that survived fires which consumed the homes containing them. From Ötzi, the Iceman, whose 5,300-year-old corpse kills those who disturb his frozen tomb. To Robert the Doll, whose button eyes follow visitors through a Florida museum with intelligence that should not exist in painted glass and sewn fabric. These are not English legends. These are global testaments to a truth that transcends geography. That some objects become vessels for forces that defy rational explanation. That curses are not superstition but consequence. That the material world absorbs our violence, our greed, our betrayals, and remembers everything. The relics we will examine tonight exist. You can visit most of them, touch some of them, though doing so requires signing waivers acknowledging the risks. They rest in museums behind protective glass, their malevolence contained but never diminished. They hide in private collections, guarded by owners who understand they possess not treasures, but burdens. They wait in vaults and temples and locked rooms, exerting influence that extends far beyond their physical presence. Before we begin this catalogue, I invite you to consider your relationship with the objects that surround you. That inherited jewellery passed down through troubled lineages. Does it carry more than sentiment? That antique mirror reflecting your face tonight. What faces did it reflect before yours? And what did those faces witness? The stones of your home, if it is old enough. What memories are trapped in their substance? What violence soaked into foundations that now support your daily life? Our ancestors understood something that modern materialism has forgotten. That objects absorb intention, that artifacts can become repositories for human emotion, concentrated and preserved across centuries. That a curse is not mere superstition, but recognition that some actions create consequences that outlast the actors who initiated them. Tonight, we catalogue 7 cursed relics from beyond England's borders. 7 artifacts representing 7 continents of human experience with the supernatural. 7 objects that prove the material world is not passive, but participatory in the ongoing drama of human consequence. If you value these explorations into humanity's darker heritage, into the relics that remember when we would prefer to forget, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment with which cursed object speaks to you most deeply. Which relic would you dare to touch, knowing the weight it carries? Which curse would you risk believing yourself exempt from the patterns that destroyed those who came before? I am Mr. Ravenhurst, and tonight we delve into the cursed relics of the world. 7 artifacts that bridge the gap between dead past and living present. 7 objects that prove some things never forget, never forgive, never release their hold on the world that created them. Let us begin with perhaps the most famous cursed gemstone in human history. A diamond so blue it seems to hold captured twilight. So beautiful that emperors murdered to possess it. So cursed that it has left a trail of bodies across 3 continents and 4 centuries. The Hope Diamond, the Eye of the Goddess, the stone that kills. Chapter 1. The Hope Diamond, the Eye of the Goddess. Deep blue, not the pale blue of sky or the bright blue of shallow water, but the blue of twilight at the moment before night claims complete dominion. The blue of deep ocean where light struggles to penetrate. The blue of something caught between states, neither fully one thing nor another. This is the color of the Hope Diamond. 45.52 carats of crystallized carbon that has witnessed empires rise and collapse. That has adorned the necks of queens who died on guillotines, and the fingers of heiresses who descended into madness. That currently rests in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History, displayed behind bulletproof glass that protects viewers not from theft, but from something far more insidious. The curse. The diamond's origins lie not in the earth, but in blasphemy. According to legend preserved in Hindu texts and French colonial records, the stone was originally the eye of a statue of the goddess Sita in a temple near Mandalay in what is now Myanmar. The exact date is lost, but accounts place the theft sometime in the early 17th century, during the period when European colonial powers were penetrating deeper into Asia, bringing Christianity, commerce, and catastrophe to civilizations that had existed for millennia without requiring salvation. The thief, according to these accounts, was either a temple priest who betrayed his sacred trust, or a French merchant named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, who purchased the stone from such a priest, knowingly acquiring sacred property that should never have entered the commercial sphere. The details vary depending on which version one consults, but the essential violation remains constant. A sacred object, specifically consecrated to divine purpose, was torn from its rightful place and thrust into the world of human greed. The curse that followed was not pronounced by any human authority, but emerged from the act itself. The desecration of the sacred, the transformation of the divine into the commercial, the reduction of a goddess's eye to a merchant's inventory. In Hindu cosmology, such violations do not require supernatural punishment because they are already supernatural crimes. They disrupt the cosmic order, creating karmic imbalances that must be corrected through suffering proportional to the initial transgression. The diamond, now separated from its divine purpose, became a vessel for this corrective karma. Every person who possessed it would pay the price for the original theft, compounded by their own willingness to benefit from blasphemy. Tavernier, if he was indeed the thief or initial purchaser, returned to France in 1668 with the diamond among his treasures. He was 63 years old, wealthy beyond measure from a lifetime of trading in Asian gemstones. He sold the blue diamond to King Louis XIV in 1668 for a sum equivalent to approximately 147 kilograms of pure gold. But wealth purchased from cursed objects provides no protection from consequences. According to accounts preserved in French court records and later historical analyses, Tavernier's final years were marked by catastrophe that seemed to pursue him with supernatural consistency. His business ventures failed. His family fractured through disputes over his wealth. His health deteriorated in ways that physicians of the era could not explain. In 1689, at age 84, Tavernier died in Russia under circumstances that remain disputed. Some accounts claim he died in Moscow of natural causes. Others suggest he was torn apart by wild dogs while traveling through frozen wilderness, a death so improbable and horrible that it suggested forces beyond mere misfortune. The diamond, now in royal possession, was recut from its original 112 carats to 69 carats, the reduction in size supposedly enhancing its color and clarity. It became known as the Blue Diamond of the Crown, or Le Bleu de France. King Louis XIV wore it occasionally on ceremonial occasions, but primarily kept it secured in the royal treasury, perhaps sensing the weight it carried beyond its physical mass. Louis XIV died in 1715 after a reign of 72 years, the longest in European history. But his death, while not immediately violent, came after years of watching his family destroyed by disease and misfortune. 3 legitimate sons died before him. His grandson died before him. His great-grandson survived, but only barely, inheriting a kingdom bankrupted by wars and extravagances that the cursed diamond had witnessed from its place in the royal collection. The diamond passed to Louis XV, then to Louis XVI, and here the curse manifested with such dramatic clarity that even skeptics acknowledged forces beyond coincidence seemed to be operating. Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette both wore the Hope diamond on ceremonial occasions. Marie Antoinette was particularly fond of it, having it set in various pieces of jewellery, delighting in how its deep blue complemented her pale complexion and elaborate gowns. She wore it at Versailles parties, at state functions, at moments of royal celebration when the French monarchy seemed eternal and untouchable. But beneath the surface, revolution was fermenting, economic crisis, social inequality, Enlightenment philosophy that questioned the divine right of kings. The diamond glittered on Marie Antoinette's neck while France starved, while resentment built into rage that would eventually consume the monarchy entirely. In 1792, as revolutionary fervour reached its peak, the French crown jewels were looted from the royal storehouse. The Hope diamond disappeared into the chaos of the revolution, stolen by thieves who believed they were seizing symbols of oppression, but were actually acquiring curses that would pursue them for generations. Louis XVI was guillotined in January 1793. His head fell into a basket while crowds cheered, the divine right of kings ending in blood on a public platform. Marie Antoinette followed in October of the same year. She who had worn the cursed diamond at the height of her power died with her head severed from her body by a blade designed to deliver equality through mechanized death. The diamond itself vanished for 20 years. Its location during this period remains unknown. Speculation suggests it passed through the hands of various revolutionary looters, each of whom met unfortunate ends documented in fragmentary police records and family histories. Some died in the terror that consumed the revolution itself, guillotined by the same forces they had supported. Others died in the Napoleonic Wars that followed. Others simply disappeared from historical record, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The diamond resurfaced in London in 1812, recut again to its current size of 45.52 carats, the reduction destroying evidence of its origin while concentrating its curse into denser form. It was purchased by a London diamond merchant named Daniel Eliasson, who sold it in 1830 to banker Henry Philip Hope, from whom it derived its current name. The Hope family's experience with the diamond proved the curse operated with consistent mathematics, regardless of nationality or century. Henry Philip Hope died in 1839, within 9 years of acquiring the stone. The diamond passed to his nephew Henry Thomas Hope, who kept it secured in his collection, rarely displaying it, perhaps sensing its malevolent weight. But the curse could not be contained through mere avoidance. Henry Thomas Hope's grandson, Lord Francis Hope, inherited the diamond in 1887. He was 21 years old, aristocratic, wealthy, positioned for a life of privilege and influence. Instead, he experienced systematic destruction that followed the pattern established over 2 centuries. His marriage to American actress May Yohe scandalized London society, causing social ostracism. His business investments failed with suspicious consistency. His health deteriorated. His gambling debts mounted. By 1901, desperate for funds, he sold the Hope diamond to a London dealer for approximately £40,000, far less than its true value, accepting the loss in exchange for escaping the curse that had bankrupted him emotionally, financially, and physically. The diamond's subsequent journey through the early 20th century reads like a casualty list. It was purchased by Simon Frankel, a New York diamond merchant who died shortly after acquisition. Then by Sultan Abdul Hamid II of Turkey, who was deposed in a revolution in 1909 and spent the rest of his life in exile. The diamond was allegedly stolen from the Sultan by a Turkish official who was later hanged. It passed to Greek merchant Simon Montharides, who died in a carriage accident that threw him and his family off a cliff, to Russian Prince Ivan Kanitovsky, who was murdered during the Bolshevik Revolution, to French actress Mademoiselle Ledoux, who was shot by a jealous lover. Each owner added their death to the diamond's accumulated karma, their suffering becoming part of the stone's history, absorbed into its crystalline structure like blood into fabric. In 1911, the Hope diamond was purchased by Evelyn Walsh McLean, an American heiress whose personal fortune made her one of the wealthiest women in the world. She was warned about the curse. Multiple people, including the jeweler Pierre Cartier, who sold it to her, informed her of the diamond's history. But Evelyn believed she was different, that her wealth and social position made her immune to curses that affected lesser people, that American optimism could overcome old world superstition. She was wrong. Evelyn Walsh McLean's life after acquiring the Hope diamond became a catalogue of tragedies that seemed designed to prove the curse operated with systematic thoroughness. Her eldest son, Vincent, was killed in a car accident in 1919 at age 9. Her daughter, also named Evelyn, died of an overdose in 1946 at age 25. Her husband, Edward McLean, descended into alcoholism and insanity, eventually being institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital where he died in 1941. Evelyn herself struggled with addiction, depression, and financial ruin. The Washington Post, her family's newspaper empire, was sold to pay debts. Her health deteriorated. She spent her final years in increasing isolation, the Hope diamond still in her possession but providing no comfort, no protection, only the weight of accumulated consequences that she had believed herself exempt from experiencing. When Evelyn Walsh McLean died in 1947, she was buried with the Hope diamond. But her family, recognizing forces they could not control, had the diamond removed from her coffin before burial. It was sold to jeweler Harry Winston, who kept it for 11 years before donating it to the Smithsonian Institution in 1958, ending its circulation through private hands and theoretically neutralizing the curse through public ownership. But has the curse truly ended, or has it merely changed form? The Hope diamond now resides in the Janet Annenberg Hooker Hall of Geology, Gems and Minerals at the National Museum of Natural History. It is displayed in a rotating case that allows viewers to observe it from all angles. Approximately 7 million people see it annually, making it one of the most visited objects in the entire Smithsonian collection. Museum documentation acknowledges the curse in educational materials, but frames it as legend rather than verified phenomenon. Security measures protecting the diamond are justified through its monetary value, estimated at $200 to $250 million, rather than supernatural concerns. The bulletproof glass, the alarms, the constant surveillance, all protect against human theft rather than karmic consequence. Yet reports from museum staff who work directly with the Hope Diamond suggest the curse has not been neutralized, merely distributed. Multiple employees across decades have reported similar experiences. Dreams where they witness the diamond's history, seeing Marie Antoinette's execution, Evelyn Walsh McLean's son's accident, the deaths of owners whose names they did not previously know, feelings of being watched when near the display case, sudden onset of anxiety or dread that dissipates the moment they move away from the gem. More disturbing are the patterns in visitor experiences. Thousands have reported feeling compelled to touch the glass case, despite barriers and warnings. Many describe the diamond as appearing to shift color or emit light that should not be possible given the controlled lighting conditions. Some claim to hear whispers or see faces reflected in the glass that do not correspond to actual people nearby. Skeptics attribute these experiences to suggestion and expectation. People know about the curse, therefore they interpret normal sensory experiences through that framework. The diamond becomes a Rorschach test, revealing viewers' own superstitions rather than demonstrating actual supernatural properties. But this explanation fails to account for experiences reported by visitors who claim no prior knowledge of the curse, who approach the diamond as simply another museum exhibit, who experience sudden dread or compulsion or psychological disturbance only after viewing it, not before, who describe sensations consistent with hundreds of other reports, despite having no framework for expecting such reactions. The scientific analysis of the Hope Diamond reveals anomalies that deepen rather than resolve questions about its nature. The blue color derives from trace amounts of boron within the carbon crystal structure, creating light absorption patterns that produce its distinctive hue. Under ultraviolet light, the diamond phosphoresces, emitting an eerie red glow that persists for several seconds after the UV source is removed. This property is rare among diamonds, occurring in less than 1% of blue diamonds. Gemologists who have studied the Hope Diamond extensively note that its cut, while not conforming to modern standards of brilliance maximization, creates internal reflections that give the stone an unusual depth. Looking into the diamond does not show a simple play of light, but rather suggests infinite recession, as if the stone contains more space than its physical dimensions should allow. This quality, termed the eye effect by some researchers, creates the impression that something within the diamond is looking back at the observer. Whether this is optical illusion produced by specific facet angles or something more difficult to explain through conventional gemology remains debated. The curse of the Hope Diamond operates through a specific mechanism that appears across cursed objects worldwide. The object is not inherently evil, but becomes a vessel for consequences generated by human actions. The theft from the temple violated sacred boundaries, creating karmic debt. Each subsequent owner who accepted the stolen goods became complicit in that original violation, assuming responsibility for the debt without understanding its terms. The suffering that followed was not arbitrary punishment, but mathematical correction. The universe, or karma, or divine justice, however one chooses to name the mechanism, enforces balance through whatever means necessary. The diamond becomes the medium through which this enforcement operates, concentrating consequences in ways that affect everyone who claims ownership. But there is a deeper pattern worth noting. The Hope Diamond's victims were not random. They were almost exclusively people of wealth and power, kings and queens, aristocrats and heiresses. Those who believed their position exempted them from consequences that governed ordinary people. The curse targeted precisely those most convinced of their own immunity, demonstrating that no amount of worldly power protects against cosmic accounting. This suggests the curse functions not just as punishment, but as correction to social imbalance. The wealthy suffer because they stole or purchased stolen goods and believed their money sanctified the theft. The powerful suffer because they assumed power justified possession. The curse becomes equalizer, demonstrating that divine law operates independently of human hierarchies. In Hindu philosophy, the concept of karma operates according to precise principles that Western understanding often misconstrues as mystical randomness. Karma is not fate or destiny imposed by external force, but consequence inherent in action itself. Every action contains within it the seeds of its own results. Theft generates loss. Violence generates violence. Desecration of the sacred generates suffering, proportional to the original violation. The Hope Diamond embodies these principles in crystalline form. It is not cursed by any external entity pronouncing doom, but carries within its structure the accumulated consequences of centuries of theft, greed, and the willingness of the powerful to benefit from blasphemy. Every person who possessed it added their own karma to the accumulated burden, compounding the original violation through their complicity. Stand before the Hope Diamond today at the Smithsonian. Watch it rotate slowly in its case, catching light, refracting it into depths that seem to extend beyond physical dimensions. Notice the other visitors, how they press close to the glass despite barriers, how they photograph it obsessively despite signs requesting they do not, how they reach out as if to touch it, held back only by social convention and security presence. What are they feeling? What draws them to an object whose documented history is catastrophe? Why do 7 million people annually make pilgrimage to view a rock, however beautiful, however valuable, when the museum contains thousands of specimens equally remarkable from purely mineralogical perspective? They come because the curse is real, not in the sense of supernatural entity actively harming people, but in the sense of accumulated karma made visible. The diamond proves that actions have consequences that extend far beyond the original actors. That theft creates debt that must be paid. That no amount of wealth or power exempts anyone from cosmic mathematics. The victims speak through the stone. Marie Antoinette, whose head fell into a basket while the diamond she had worn glittered in revolutionary hands. Evelyn Walsh McLean's son, dead at 9 in an accident that seemed too perfectly timed to be mere misfortune. The Turkish officials, Russian princes, French actresses, all who believed they could possess beauty without acknowledging its price. Their deaths were not supernatural interventions, but natural conclusions to premises established at the moment of the diamond's theft. They claimed ownership of what could not be owned. They participated in circulation of what should have remained sacred. And the universe, operating according to laws more fundamental than human jurisprudence, enforced the only verdict such violations permit. The Hope Diamond remains at the Smithsonian. It will likely remain there for generations, perhaps centuries. Public ownership theoretically distributes the curse across millions, diluting its intensity below the threshold where individual catastrophe manifests. Or perhaps the curse merely waits, accumulating karma from the museum itself, from the institution that profits from displaying stolen sacred objects, from a nation built on theft of land and exploitation of peoples who understood the relationship between human and divine far better than the civilization that conquered them. Only time will tell, and the diamond has nothing but time. 45.52 carats of crystallized carbon that predates human civilization by millions of years and will outlast human civilization by millions more. It remembers everything, forgets nothing, and continues to exact payment from those who believe beauty justifies theft, that power excuses blasphemy, that the world exists to satisfy human desire regardless of cosmic cost. We ascend now from the blue depths of the Hope Diamond, from karmic mathematics made visible in crystalline form, from the eye of the goddess that sees everything and never blinks. we turn to an entirely different species of curse. Not theft of the sacred, but mass production of malevolence. Not singular gem, but replicated image. To paintings that should be harmless decoration, but instead became instruments of destruction that consumed hundreds of homes across Europe. To the crying boy paintings, the mass-produced curse. Chapter 2. The crying boy paintings, mass-produced malevolence. Fire has temperature, chemistry, physics. It is not supernatural, but entirely natural. A chemical reaction requiring 3 elements: fuel, oxygen, heat. Remove any element and fire cannot exist, but provide all 3 in abundance, and fire becomes not merely possible, but inevitable. This is scientific fact, understood, rational, explainable through principles taught in every high school chemistry class. But what scientific principle explains paintings that survive fires, which consume everything around them? What chemistry allows cheap prints mass-produced in 50s factories to emerge unscathed from conflagrations that reduce homes to ash? What physics permits specific images of weeping children to remain intact while the frames that held them, the walls that supported them, the very buildings that contained them collapse into rubble? The crying boy paintings defy explanation. Not because they are supernatural, but because the pattern of their survival is so consistent, so well documented, so thoroughly verified through decades of fire marshal reports and insurance investigations, that dismissing them as coincidence requires ignoring evidence that would be accepted as proof in any other context. These are not legends whispered in darkness. They are phenomena documented in newspapers, investigated by authorities, and experienced by thousands across Europe who watched their homes burn while cheap prints of sad-eyed children emerged undamaged from the wreckage. The paintings originated with Giovanni Bragolin, an Italian painter working under the name Bruno Amadio in post-war Europe. The exact dates are disputed, but most sources place the creation of the original Crying Boy series between 1950 and 1954. The paintings depicted children, primarily boys but some girls, with tears streaming down their faces, expressions combining sadness with something harder to define. Not quite fear, not quite grief, but something that made viewers uncomfortable in ways they struggled to articulate. The subjects were reportedly orphans from the streets of post-war Venice and Naples, children who had lost parents to the war, to disease, to the chaos that followed Italy's defeat and occupation. Amadio would find them begging or living in ruins, offer them small payments to pose, and capture their genuine despair in oil paint that he then mass-produced through chromolithography, creating thousands of identical prints sold cheaply across Europe. According to accounts that vary in detail but agree in essence, Amadio became convinced that the children he painted were cursed, that their suffering was not mere circumstance but supernatural affliction. That painting them transferred their curse to the canvas, creating images that carried malevolent power beyond their aesthetic content. This belief was strengthened, the story goes, when Amadio's studio burned in 1955. The fire destroyed his equipment, his inventory, his original paintings. But the prints that had already been distributed survived the fires in the homes where they hung, prompting investigation that revealed the pattern was already establishing itself across Italy. Whether Amadio deliberately created cursed images or merely documented existing curses is debated. Some versions of the legend claim he used occult techniques during the painting process, incorporating sigils or performing rituals that bound malevolent forces to the canvas. Others suggest the children themselves were cursed, and Amadio's act of painting them simply created permanent records of their affliction. But the documented facts beyond the legend are these. Beginning in the 1950s and accelerating through the 60s and 70s, fires occurred in homes across Italy, Spain, and eventually the United Kingdom that followed a disturbingly consistent pattern. The homes burned completely, furniture reduced to ash, walls collapsed, electrical systems melted, family photographs destroyed, everything consumed by flames that reached temperatures sufficient to melt glass and warp metal. But the Crying Boy paintings survived. Not merely partially damaged or scorched, but completely intact, still in their frames, glass uncracked, images showing no smoke damage, no heat distortion, no indication whatsoever that they had been subjected to the inferno that destroyed everything around them. Fire marshals investigating these incidents documented the phenomenon in official reports that remain archived in fire department records across Europe. The consistency of the survival pattern defied normal fire behavior. Prints should burn easily. They are paper, one of the most combustible common materials. The frames, typically cheap wood or plastic, should ignite and contribute fuel to the fire. The glass should crack from thermal shock. None of this occurred with the Crying Boy paintings. The curse became widely publicized in the United Kingdom in 1985, when the Sun newspaper ran a series of articles documenting house fires, where Crying Boy prints had survived intact. The newspaper solicited stories from readers, and the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of people wrote in describing fires in their homes, where everything burned except the painting. The consistency of the reports could not be attributed to mass hysteria or suggestion, because many correspondents were unaware of other incidents until reading the newspaper coverage. The reports followed a pattern so regular it suggested mechanism rather than coincidence. The fire would start in a room distant from where the painting hung, often the kitchen or bedroom. It would spread rapidly, consuming the structure with unusual intensity. Fire services would arrive to find the building substantially destroyed. And during post-fire investigation, they would discover the Crying Boy print, still hanging on a wall, or fallen to the floor but undamaged, or resting atop piles of ash that had once been furniture. Some fires included multiple unusual elements beyond the painting's survival. Electrical systems failing in ways that suggested deliberate sabotage rather than accident. Fires spreading in patterns inconsistent with normal flame progression. Unusually high temperatures that could not be explained by the available fuel load. And most disturbing, reports from residents who woke to find fires already advanced beyond the point where they should have been detectable earlier through smoke or heat. One case documented in Yorkshire involved a family who had received a Crying Boy print as a wedding gift in 1968. Over the following 17 years, they experienced 3 separate house fires. Each fire destroyed their home. Each fire required them to rebuild or relocate. And each time, the Crying Boy print survived completely undamaged. After the 3rd fire, the family attempted to destroy the painting by burning it themselves in a controlled outdoor fire. They reported that the print would not ignite. They poured accelerant directly on it. The accelerant burned. The painting did not. Eventually, they buried it in their garden, hoping to be rid of the curse without actually destroying it. Within a year, another fire consumed their home. When they excavated the garden afterward, they found the painting exactly where they had buried it. The frame rotted from soil contact, but the image itself pristine, as if it had been printed that day rather than buried for months. Fire investigators who analyzed the phenomenon proposed various rational explanations. Perhaps the prints were treated with fire-retardant chemicals during manufacturing, either deliberately or accidentally through the materials used in 1950s printing processes. Perhaps the glass covering the prints created conditions that starved the paper of oxygen, preventing combustion. Perhaps survival bias skewed the data, with people remembering prints that survived while forgetting hundreds that burned normally. These explanations faced immediate challenges. Chemical analysis of surviving prints found no unusual fire-retardant compounds. The glass-oxygen starvation theory failed to explain why the frames burned while the prints did not, or why the glass itself did not crack from heat. And the survival bias argument could not account for the fact that other prints and paintings in the same fires were destroyed. Only the crying boy images consistently survived. More elaborate theories suggested the paintings created psychological conditions that led to fire-starting behavior. Perhaps owners of the prints, influenced by the sad imagery or subconsciously disturbed by the children's expressions, became more careless with fire safety. Or perhaps the curse operated through psychological mechanism, creating anxiety that manifested as unconscious arson. But this explanation collapsed under the weight of documented cases where fires were conclusively determined to have non-human causes. Electrical faults, lightning strikes, mechanical failures in heating systems, accidents initiated by circumstances completely unrelated to human psychology. Yet in these fires too, the crying boy prints survived, while everything else burned. By the mid-1980s, the curse had become so widely acknowledged that fire brigades in several regions unofficially advised people to remove crying boy prints from their homes. This was not official policy. Any fire chief would deny recommending actions based on supernatural belief. But individual firefighters, having witnessed too many incidents to dismiss as coincidence, would quietly suggest that the paintings be disposed of. But disposal proved its own challenge. People who attempted to burn the prints reported the same phenomenon as the Yorkshire family. The paintings would not ignite, or they would burn partially, but the children's faces would remain visible through the flames, as if the image was printed deeper than the surface, impossible to fully erase. Some reported that after attempting to burn the prints, fires would start in their homes that night or within days, as if the paintings were retaliating for the destruction attempt. The Sun newspaper, having published dozens of accounts of the curse, organized a mass burning in 1985. Readers were invited to send their crying boy prints to the newspaper, which would destroy them in a controlled bonfire supervised by fire services. Thousands of prints arrived. The burn was conducted as a public event, covered by media, witnessed by firefighters and journalists. Contemporary accounts described that the prints burned, but not normally. The flames surrounding them reportedly turned blue or green, colors suggesting chemical reactions that should not occur with ordinary paper and ink. The smoke produced had an acrid quality that caused observers to retreat, complaining of nausea and dizziness. And several witnesses claimed to hear sounds from the fire, not the crackling of combustion, but something that resembled children crying, though this was likely interpreted through expectation rather than actual phenomenon. The bonfire reduced the prints to ash. The Sun declared the curse broken, and for several years, reports of crying boy-related fires declined significantly in the United Kingdom. The mass burning seemed to have achieved its purpose, destroying not just the physical prints, but the psychological belief that gave the curse power. But the curse was not ended. It was merely relocated. Through the 1990s and 2000s, reports of fires associated with crying boy prints emerged from Spain, where the paintings had been distributed widely in the 1960s and 70s. Then Italy, then former Soviet states where bootleg copies had circulated. The pattern remained consistent. Homes burned, prints survived. Families watched their possessions reduced to ash, while the sad-eyed children gazed out from frames that should have been consumed hours earlier. Modern paranormal researchers have attempted to document and analyze the phenomenon through more rigorous methodology than newspaper accounts and anecdotal reports. Several purchased original prints and subjected them to controlled testing. Fire resistance tests, chemical analysis, even attempts to determine if the paintings affected electromagnetic fields or other measurable environmental variables. The results were inconclusive but unsettling. The prints showed no unusual fire resistance under controlled laboratory conditions. They burned like any other paper product when subjected to direct flame, but researchers noted anomalous results in other tests. Electromagnetic field detectors registered fluctuations near the prints that did not occur with control images. Temperature sensors showed cold spots that moved in patterns suggesting intelligence rather than random air currents. And multiple researchers reported psychological effects, persistent sadness or anxiety that lifted the moment they left proximity to the paintings. More disturbing were reports from researchers who attempted to replicate the conditions of house fires. They built scale models of rooms, furnished them with miniature furniture and decorations, hung crying boy prints on the walls, and started fires using various ignition methods. In several trials, the prints survived when they should not have. Not every time, but frequently enough to suggest something beyond random chance was operating. One researcher documented 20 trials. In normal distribution, given fire behavior and the materials involved, all 20 prints should have burned. Instead, 7 survived completely intact. 3 survived partially. Only 10 were completely destroyed. The survival rate of 50% could not be explained through the materials, fire behavior, or experimental design. Something about the specific images seemed to interact with fire in ways that defied normal combustion physics. The psychological dimension of the crying boy curse operates differently than most cursed objects. The paintings do not harm their owners directly through supernatural means. Instead, they seem to attract fire or create conditions where fire becomes more likely. Whether this is actual supernatural influence or psychological effect remains genuinely unclear, even to those who have studied the phenomenon extensively. Some psychologists suggest the sad imagery creates subconscious stress that manifests as carelessness or unconscious fire-starting behavior. Others propose that the paintings serve as cultural focal point for anxieties about domestic safety, allowing people to project their fears onto external object rather than acknowledging their own vulnerability to random catastrophe. But these explanations feel inadequate when confronted with specific cases. The house fires that start from lightning strikes or electrical faults beyond human control. The survival of prints in fires that consumed everything else so completely that even metal objects melted. The consistency of reports across cultures and decades, describing identical phenomena in identical language, despite having no knowledge of other incidents. The environmental dimension of the curse relates to post-war trauma and the suffering of orphaned children whose despair was commodified for profit. The original subjects, if the legend is accurate, were genuine war orphans paid minimal sums to pose for paintings that would be mass-produced and sold across Europe. Their suffering became decoration. Their tears became aesthetic choice. Their trauma was reproduced thousands of times and hung in living rooms where families who had survived the war displayed images of children who had not. Perhaps the curse is not supernatural at all, but rather karmic consequence of commodifying suffering. Each print became a memorial to child who lost everything, whose pain was captured and sold, whose image was replicated until they became not individuals, but mass-produced symbols. The fires that followed might be understood as these children's rage finally manifesting, destroying the homes of those who had turned their suffering into wallpaper. In this interpretation, the prince surviving the fires is not protection, but presence. The children refusing to be erased, even as everything around them is consumed. They remain, watching, ensuring that their suffering is not forgotten, even when homes burn and families flee and everything else turns to ash. Modern distribution of crying boy prints continues despite the curse's notoriety. Original prints from the 1950s and 60s command high prices from collectors who either disbelieve the curse or find the risk exciting. Reproductions are sold as kitsch, often marketed specifically because of the curse rather than despite it. And new fires continue to be reported, though with less media coverage, where crying boy prints survive while homes burn. The curse teaches us that mass production does not diminish supernatural power, but distributes it. That creating thousands of identical images does not dilute the curse, but multiplies it, spreading malevolence across continents and decades. That suffering commodified becomes suffering weaponized. That trauma exploited for profit generates consequences that pursue the profiteers with mathematical precision. Stand before a crying boy print today. They are not difficult to find. Online auction sites, antique shops, estate sales where elderly owners passed away, and families dispose of possessions without knowing their history. Look at the child's face, the tears painted with skill sufficient to suggest genuine emotion, the eyes that seem to follow viewers regardless of viewing angle. What do you feel? Sadness, discomfort, the urge to look away? These responses are not mere aesthetic judgment, but recognition of something deeper. The paintings carry weight beyond their artistic merit. They embody suffering made permanent, children whose pain was never addressed, but merely documented and sold. Fire will come to some homes that contain these prints. Statistics alone suggest this inevitability. When fire comes, will the print survive? Will the pattern continue? Will firefighters arrive to find another home reduced to ash with a sad-eyed child gazing out from a frame that should have burned hours earlier? The answer is unknowable until fire provides it. But the consistency of past patterns suggests the curse continues, operating according to laws we do not fully understand, enforcing consequences for violations we may not recognize we have committed. We descend now from mass-produced malevolence to something far more ancient, from paintings created in the 20th century to a body that predates civilization itself, to Ötzi the Iceman, whose 5,300-year-old corpse kills those who disturb his frozen tomb, to the curse of the ancient dead, whose rest we have violated in the name of science, and whose vengeance transcends any human understanding of time or justice. Chapter 3. Ötzi the Iceman, The Vengeance of the Ancient Dead. September 19th, 1991. The Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy. Altitude 3,210 meters, where air is thin and cold and human presence is temporary at best. Two German hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, are descending from the Finalspitze peak when they notice something unusual protruding from melting ice. At first, they assume it is trash. Hikers frequently discover debris deposited by glaciers, remnants of climbers who passed through decades earlier. But as they approach, they realize they are looking at a human body, face down, partially embedded in ice, the skin leathery and brown, preserved by cold in ways they cannot immediately comprehend. They photograph it, report it to Austrian authorities, and set in motion a sequence of events that will reveal one of archaeology's most significant discoveries, while simultaneously demonstrating that some dead should not be disturbed. The body is extracted over several days using ice axes and pneumatic drills. The work is difficult. The corpse is frozen into ice that has held it for over 5 millennia. When finally freed and examined by experts, the assessment is stunning. This is not a modern climber who died in recent decades. This is a man from the Copper Age who died approximately 3,300 years before Christ, whose body and equipment have been preserved by glacial ice in unprecedented condition. He is named Ötzi after the Ötztal Alps where he was discovered, and he becomes instantly one of the most important archaeological finds in European history. A time capsule from the Copper Age offering insights into diet, health, clothing, tools, and social structures of a period about which little direct evidence exists. But Ötzi is not merely an archaeological specimen. He is a human being who died violently, murdered. And the curse that follows those who disturb him suggests that his death created obligations that transcend the centuries, that bind the ancient dead to the living, in ways that science cannot measure, but can certainly document. The forensic analysis of Ötzi's body reveals a life of hardship and a death of violence. He was approximately 45 years old at death, elderly by Copper Age standards. His body shows evidence of chronic health conditions, arthritis in his joints, hardened arteries suggesting cardiovascular disease, intestinal parasites, dental cavities, all the accumulated damage of a difficult life in a harsh environment. But it was not disease that killed him. It was murder. An arrowhead is found lodged in his left shoulder, having entered from behind, severing the subclavian artery. This wound would have caused rapid blood loss and death within minutes. The arrow shaft had been removed, possibly by Ötzi himself in his final moments, or by his killer retrieving the evidence. Additional injuries suggest he fought before dying. A deep cut on his right hand, likely defensive wound from grabbing a blade. Blunt force trauma to his head, possibly from being struck while incapacitated by the arrow wound. His death was not clean or quick, but violent, brutal. The result of interpersonal conflict whose cause can never be known, but whose consequences echo across 5,300 years. The equipment found with Ötzi speaks to a man of status and knowledge. A copper axe, valuable beyond measure in the Copper Age, when metal was rare and precious. A longbow of yew wood, unfinished, suggesting he was in the process of crafting it when events interrupted his work. A quiver containing 14 arrows, only 2 of which were finished and flight-ready. A flint dagger with wooden handle and leather sheath. All tools suggesting a hunter or warrior, someone accustomed to violence and survival in hostile terrain. His clothing demonstrates sophisticated understanding of mountain conditions. Coat made from woven grass and goat hide, leggings of goat leather, shoes insulated with grass, designed for snow and ice, a bearskin hat, layers of protection against cold that killed casually and constantly in alpine environments. And on his body, tattoos, 61 in total, created by making small incisions and rubbing charcoal into the wounds. They are located on areas corresponding to chronic pain, his lower back, his knees, suggesting they serve therapeutic purpose rather than purely decorative function. Ötzi knew suffering and sought to manage it through methods that combined the practical with the potentially ritual. All of this makes Ötzi invaluable to science. He is the oldest naturally mummified human ever discovered in Europe. His preservation is so complete that even his last meal can be analyzed, revealing ibex meat and einkorn wheat consumed hours before death. Pollen grains in his digestive tract allow reconstruction of his final journey through specific valleys and elevations. His DNA has been sequenced, revealing genetic markers and ancestral connections to modern populations. But this scientific value came at a cost that began manifesting almost immediately after his discovery: the curse. Helmut Simon, the hiker who discovered Ötzi, died in October 2004 during a hiking trip in the same region where he had found the Iceman 13 years earlier. He was caught in a blizzard, became disoriented, and died from hypothermia and injuries sustained falling down a slope. His body was not found for 8 days despite extensive search efforts. When finally located, he was frozen in conditions eerily similar to those that had preserved Ötzi for 53 centuries. Dieter Warnecke, the head of the mountain rescue team that recovered Helmut Simon's body, died 1 hour after Simon's funeral. Heart attack. He was 45 years old, the same age as Ötzi at death. Medical examiners found no prior history of cardiac problems. The death was sudden, unexpected, and according to those who knew him, completely out of character for a man in peak physical condition who regularly operated in high-altitude environments that demanded cardiovascular fitness. Rainer Henn, forensic pathologist who handled Ötzi's body during initial examination and transport, died in a car accident in 1992 while traveling to a conference where he was scheduled to present findings about the Iceman. His car collided with another vehicle head-on. The driver of the other car survived with minor injuries. Hen was killed instantly. The collision occurred on a straight stretch of road in good weather conditions, circumstances that made the accident difficult to explain through normal driving errors. Kurt Fritz, mountain guide who led the team that removed Ötzi from the ice, died in an avalanche in 1993. He was alone at the time, conducting what should have been a routine inspection of a trail he had guided on hundreds of times previously. The avalanche was small, localized, occurring in conditions that normally would not trigger such events. Fritz's experience should have allowed him to recognize and avoid the danger. Yet he was caught, buried, and died before rescue could arrive. Konrad Spindler, archaeologist who headed the initial research team studying Ötzi, died of complications from multiple sclerosis in 2004. He had been diagnosed years before coming into contact with the Iceman, so his death cannot be attributed directly to the curse. But Spindler himself believed in the curse and stated publicly that he felt he was on the list, that working with Ötzi had marked him for death, that the disease's progression accelerated after his involvement with the frozen corpse. Helmut Simon's wife, Erika, who discovered the body alongside her husband, survived but faced extraordinary misfortune. Shortly after her husband's death, she was diagnosed with cancer. She survived treatment but spoke in interviews about feeling haunted by the discovery, about dreams where Ötzi appeared to her, not threatening but sorrowful, as if trying to communicate something she could not understand. Tom Loy, molecular archaeologist who extracted DNA from Ötzi's tissue samples, died in 2005 from a rare blood disease. He was 63. His death came shortly after publishing research about blood found on Ötzi's clothing and weapons. Blood from 4 different individuals suggesting the Iceman had been involved in violent confrontations shortly before his own murder. Loy had joked about the curse in the months before his death, telling colleagues that anyone connected to Ötzi seemed marked for tragedy. The pattern is undeniable. 7 people directly involved in Ötzi's discovery, recovery, or examination have died under circumstances that range from unusual to impossible to explain through normal statistical expectation. The deaths span 13 years, from 1992 to 2005, creating a consistency that suggests mechanism rather than coincidence. Skeptics argue that this is precisely what coincidence looks like, that thousands of people have worked with Ötzi over 3 decades, and 7 deaths among that population is statistically normal. That people involved in mountain rescue and alpine archaeology face higher baseline risks of accidental death due to the nature of their work. That focusing on the deaths while ignoring the survivors creates survival bias that makes a normal distribution of mortality appear cursed. These arguments have merit, but they struggle to account for the specific circumstances of several deaths. Helmut Simon dying in the same mountains where he found Ötzi, in a blizzard that trapped an experienced hiker who knew the terrain intimately. Dieter Warnecke dying 1 hour after Simon's funeral from sudden cardiac arrest. Rainer Hen's car accident occurring in conditions where collision should not have happened. The avalanche that killed Kurt Fritz in circumstances that his experience should have allowed him to avoid. Each individual death might be explained through normal causes. Accidents happen. People die. Mountain environments are dangerous. But the clustering of deaths among people connected to Ötzi, occurring in ways that echo the Iceman's own violent end, suggests pattern that transcends statistical noise. The curse, if it exists, operates through a mechanism distinct from other cursed objects we have examined. Ötzi does not carry the curse like the Hope Diamond absorbs karmic debt from its theft. The Iceman himself is not inherently malevolent. He is a murder victim whose rest was disturbed, whose body was removed from the mountains where he died, and placed in a museum where millions can view his corpse as spectacle. In this sense, the curse might be understood as Ötzi's autonomy asserting itself. He did not consent to being excavated, studied, displayed. He died violently and was left where he fell, which in many cultures represents a kind of burial, even if not formalized through ritual. The glacier that covered him served as tomb, preserving him for 53 centuries. Those who removed him violated that tomb, however justified their scientific motivations. The deaths that followed might be not supernatural punishment, but natural consequence of violating the dead. In many traditional belief systems, disturbing human remains without proper propitiation creates spiritual debt that must be paid. The dead have rights that the living ignore at their peril. Ötzi's curse enforces those rights through the only means available to the powerless, through the suffering of those who took power over his body without his permission. This interpretation suggests the curse will continue until the debt is paid or the violation is corrected. But how does one correct the violation? Ötzi cannot be returned to the glacier. The ice that preserved him is melting due to climate change and would no longer protect his body. His scientific value is recognized worldwide, and removing him from study would be seen as capitulating to superstition rather than addressing legitimate spiritual concerns. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, where Ötzi is permanently displayed, has attempted to address the curse through both practical and spiritual means. The body is kept in a specially designed cold chamber that maintains conditions similar to glacial preservation. Viewing is limited to prevent overexposure and degradation. Only qualified researchers are allowed direct contact with the remains, and then only for approved scientific purposes. But the museum has also acknowledged spiritual dimensions that pure science struggles to address. In 2007, a shaman was brought in to perform rituals intended to appease Ötzi's spirit. The ceremony involved offerings, spoken blessings, in reconstructed Copper Age language, and acknowledgement of the violation that his disturbance represented. The shaman reported that Ötzi's spirit was not angry, but sad, mourning not for himself, but for those who had died in his name, wishing only to rest. Whether these rituals had any effect is unknowable. No deaths among researchers have occurred since 2005, but this could be coincidence rather than propitiation. The curse may have run its course, 7 deaths being sufficient payment for the disturbance. Or it may be dormant, waiting for conditions that will trigger the next manifestation. Visitors to the museum who view Ötzi report experiences that suggest his presence extends beyond the physical body. Many describe feeling suddenly cold despite the museum's climate control. Others report overwhelming sadness or sense of being watched. Some claim to hear whispers in a language they cannot understand, but which feels ancient, predating modern European tongues. These experiences are subjective and difficult to verify, but their consistency across thousands of visitors who have no prior knowledge of the curse or of each other's reports suggests something beyond mass suggestion. Ötzi affects people. His presence creates psychological responses that modern museum exhibits typically do not produce. Perhaps this is simply the natural human response to confronting mortality in such visceral form. Ötzi is death made visible. He is what we will all become, flesh stripped of life, reduced to material that will eventually return to earth. Viewing him forces recognition of our own impermanence in ways that photographs or descriptions cannot achieve. But perhaps there is more. Perhaps Ötzi's consciousness, or whatever remains of the person he was 5,300 years ago, persists in some form. Not as ghost or spirit in the traditional sense, but as imprint or resonance that certain people can perceive. His violent death, his unfinished life, his interrupted journey. all creating disturbance in reality that manifests as presence in the museum that contains his body. The forensic reconstruction of Ötzi's final days suggests a man fleeing violence. The partially digested food in his stomach places him in a valley at lower elevation hours before his death. The pollen in his digestive tract indicates he climbed rapidly, moving from valley to alpine environment in a journey that should have taken days, but which he completed in hours, suggesting desperate flight from pursuers. The blood on his weapons and clothing came from at least 4 different people, indicating combat. Whether Ötzi was hunter who became hunted, or warrior fleeing lost battle, or murder victim who fought his attackers, we cannot know. But the evidence paints a picture of a man who died afraid, in pain, far from home, knowing he would not survive his wounds. This knowledge makes the curse more comprehensible. Ötzi died incomplete. His journey was interrupted. His attackers were never brought to justice. His body was left unburied, exposed to elements, preserved by accident rather than intention. For 5,000 years he remained in the ice, neither properly dead nor able to move forward, trapped in the moment of his murder. When we removed him from that frozen tomb, we did not release him, but made his imprisonment permanent. We placed him in a climate-controlled chamber, where he will remain indefinitely, viewed by millions, studied by thousands, but never allowed to rest. The curse might be his only means of asserting agency over a situation where he has none, of demonstrating that the dead have rights that the living violate at cost. Modern discussions of museum ethics increasingly grapple with questions raised by collections that include human remains. Indigenous peoples worldwide have demanded repatriation of ancestral bodies, taken by archaeologists and anthropologists operating under colonial assumptions that science justified any violation. Many museums have complied, returning remains for proper burial according to cultural traditions. But Ötzi presents unique challenges. He predates any existing culture or ethnic group. No modern population can claim direct descent or cultural continuity with Copper Age Alpine peoples. There is no community to whom he could be returned, no tradition that could guide proper treatment of his remains. He belongs to no one, and therefore becomes property of everyone, or at least of the scientific institutions that argue his research value outweighs any spiritual concerns. This reasoning might satisfy legal and academic frameworks, but it does not address the deeper question. Does the lack of descendant community mean Ötzi has no rights? Or does it mean we must invent new frameworks for honoring the dead who belong to no living culture, who exist in historical spaces too distant for modern claims of ownership? The curse suggests that ignoring these questions comes with consequences, that the dead have autonomy regardless of whether living communities can claim them, that science's right to study human remains is not absolute, but conditional upon proper respect and recognition of what has been taken, that Ötzi, though he died 5,300 years ago, retains capacity to affect the living in ways that demand we acknowledge him not as specimen, but as person. We ascend now from alpine ice and ancient murder to different species of curse entirely, from natural mummification to deliberate imprisonment of malevolent spirit, from accidental preservation to intentional binding of forces that should never have been contained, to the Dybbuk box, where Jewish folklore meets American consumer culture, where ancient spiritual warfare is packaged in a wine cabinet and sold on eBay, to the curse that spreads through possession, that transfers through sale, that demonstrates some prisons are more dangerous than the things they contain. Chapter 4. The Dybbuk box. The spirit in the cabinet. Evil has container. This is principle understood across cultures and millennia, that malevolent forces, whether demonic entities or human spirits corrupted beyond redemption, can be bound to physical objects through ritual and will. That imprisonment is sometimes safer than destruction, because some things cannot be destroyed, only contained. The Dybbuk box embodies this principle in mundane form. A wine cabinet, approximately 12 inches tall, 9 inches wide, 8 inches deep, made of ordinary wood, probably oak, with simple brass hinges and a small door that opens to reveal space for storing bottles. Nothing about its construction suggests supernatural significance. It could be any piece of inexpensive furniture from early 20th century Eastern Europe. But inside this cabinet, according to Jewish folklore and the testimony of everyone who has owned it, resides a Dybbuk, a malicious spirit from Jewish mysticism, specifically the dislocated soul of a dead person that should have moved to the afterlife, but instead clings to the material world, seeking living hosts to possess so it can continue experiencing physical sensation and exercising will it should no longer possess. The box's documented history begins in 2003 in Portland, Oregon, though its actual origins extend decades further back to Holocaust-era Poland. Kevin Manus, a furniture restorer and antiques dealer, purchased the cabinet at an estate sale belonging to a 103-year-old Holocaust survivor named Havila. Havila's granddaughter, who was conducting the sale, explained that the box had belonged to her grandmother since before the war, that Havila had kept it hidden and locked, never allowing anyone to open it, insisting it must never be opened because it contained something dangerous. When Havila died, the granddaughter included the box in the estate sale against her siblings' protests, wanting to be rid of an object that had terrified them during childhood visits to their grandmother's home. Manis, intrigued by the story and the box's construction, purchased it for a trivial sum. The granddaughter warned him not to open it. He dismissed this as superstition. This was his first mistake, but not his last. Within hours of bringing the box to his furniture shop, Manis began experiencing phenomena that defied rational explanation. His employees reported feeling watched when near the box. Customers entering the shop would become suddenly anxious or nauseous, the symptoms disappearing the moment they left the building. Light bulbs above the box's storage shelf burned out with suspicious frequency, sometimes shattering explosively, though the fixtures showed no electrical faults. But the true manifestation began when Manis gave the box to his mother as a birthday gift. She suffered a massive stroke the same day, within hours of receiving it. When she recovered partially in the hospital, her first communication, despite being unable to speak due to stroke damage, was to write "no gift" repeatedly on paper provided by nurses. When asked what she meant, she became agitated, pointing at Manis with expression of pure terror, until medical staff sedated her. Manis reclaimed the box, disturbed but not yet convinced of supernatural cause. He gave it to his sister. She returned it within 3 days, reporting nightmares where an old woman with stringy hair and hollow eyes stood at the foot of her bed, smiling with too many teeth, whispering in a language she could not understand, but which filled her with dread so profound she would wake screaming. He gave it to his brother. The brother's hair began falling out in clumps. Within a week, he developed skin rashes that doctors could not diagnose or treat. He returned the box after 2 weeks, his health immediately beginning to improve the moment it left his possession. Manis, now convinced the box was genuinely cursed, attempted to dispose of it. But like many cursed objects, it resisted destruction and refused to remain discarded. He threw it in a dumpster. It reappeared on his shop doorstep the next morning. He left it in a park. Someone returned it, having found his business card inside one of the compartments. He tried selling it multiple times through normal channels, but each buyer returned it within days, reporting similar experiences: the nightmares, the sense of being watched, the old woman's presence. Finally, in September 2003, Manis listed the box on eBay with complete disclosure of its history and the phenomena associated with it. He titled the listing Haunted Dybbuk Box and provided detailed account of every strange occurrence since its purchase. He expected the listing to attract curiosity seekers or be dismissed as fiction. Instead, the auction attracted serious bidders willing to pay substantial sums for a cursed object. The winning bid was $140, placed by Iosif Nitsky, a college student in Missouri who collected strange artifacts and believed he could study the box safely through proper precautions. Nitsky's experience with the Dybbuk box was documented extensively through emails and journal entries later shared publicly. The phenomena intensified under his ownership, as if the Dybbuk recognized his skepticism as challenge to be overcome through escalated manifestation. Within days of receiving the box, Nitsky reported health problems, hives covering his body, chronic coughing that physicians attributed to allergies despite his having no allergy history, insomnia so severe he would remain awake for 72 hours straight, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. And when he finally did sleep, the nightmares began. The old woman appeared consistently, sometimes standing at his bedside, sometimes sitting in the corner of his room, sometimes lying beside him in bed, her breath cold against his neck. She never spoke in these dreams, but her presence communicated malevolence that bypassed language to induce pure terror at instinctual level. Nitsky also reported objects moving in his apartment when no one was present. Books falling from shelves, doors opening and closing, the smell of cat urine permeating rooms though he owned no cats. And most disturbing, the sensation of being touched when alone. Fingers running through his hair, hands pressing against his back. The feeling of being embraced by something he could not see, but could certainly feel. After owning the box for approximately 3 months, Nitsky attempted what Manis had never dared. He opened it. Inside, he found objects that Havela had placed there decades earlier as part of binding ritual. 2 locks of hair, one blonde and one dark brown, bound with thread. 2 small granite stones engraved with Hebrew words Nitsky could not read. A dried rose, a small golden wine goblet, 2 wheat pennies from 1928, and a cast-iron candlestick holder with octopus legs, bizarre object that seemed designed for ritual purpose rather than practical use. Nitsky documented the contents through photographs shared online, sparking intense discussion in paranormal communities about the object's significance. Scholars of Jewish mysticism identified the items as consistent with binding rituals used in Kabbalah to trap Dybbuks or other malicious spirits. The hair likely belonged to the person who performed the binding and the spirit being bound. The stones served as anchors, weighing the spirit down. The rose represented the life that ended. The goblet symbolized empty vessel waiting to be filled. The pennies, dated to a specific year, might mark when the binding was performed. But opening the box and disturbing these objects violated the binding's integrity. The Dybbuk, which had been contained but restless, became active in ways it had not been previously. Nitsky's health deteriorated rapidly. He developed vision problems, seeing shadows in peripheral vision that vanished when looked at directly. His hair continued falling out until he was partially bald at age 24. His relationships collapsed as friends and family reported feeling uncomfortable around him, as if he carried presence they could sense but not identify. Most disturbing were reports from Nitsky's roommate, who claimed to have seen the old woman from the nightmares in their shared apartment. Not in dreams, but while awake. She appeared in reflections, mirrors and windows showing her standing behind the roommate when he knew he was alone. The roommate moved out after 1 month, refusing to explain his decision beyond stating he could not remain in the apartment another night. Nitsky, desperate to be rid of the box but unable to simply discard it due to moral qualms about passing the curse to unsuspecting victim, sold it on eBay in February 2004. He disclosed everything in the listing, as Manis had done. The winning bidder paid over $1,000, 10 times what Nietzsche had paid, demonstrating that demand for cursed objects increases rather than decreases when their malevolent properties are verified. The box changed hands multiple times between 2004 and 2014, each owner experiencing similar phenomena and eventually selling or gifting it to someone else. The pattern was consistent: initial skepticism, gradual realization that something genuinely wrong was occurring, escalating health problems and psychological disturbance. Attempts to be rid of the object that succeeded only temporarily before the box's influence compelled its return or sale to new victim. Jason Haxton, curator of the Museum of Osteopathic Medicine in Missouri, acquired the box in 2004 after Nietzsche contacted him for advice. Haxton, trained in both scientific method and open to phenomena that defied easy categorization, approached the box as research subject rather than mere curiosity. He documented his experiences in a book published in 2011, The Dybbuk Box, providing the most detailed account available of the object's effects. Haxton reported phenomena consistent with previous owners, but also conducted research into the box's origins. Through genealogical investigation and contacts in the Jewish community, he traced Havela's history. She had survived the Holocaust by hiding in a convent in Poland where sympathetic nuns sheltered her, despite risk of execution if discovered. Before the war, she had been member of a family known for Kabbalistic knowledge, practitioners of Jewish mysticism that included techniques for spiritual warfare against demonic forces. According to Haxton's research, Havela performed the binding ritual in the early 1920s, trapping a Dybbuk that had been terrorizing her community. The Dybbuk was allegedly the corrupted soul of a man who had died violently and unjustly, whose rage at his death prevented him from moving to the afterlife. Instead, he remained in the physical world, seeking to possess living people and cause suffering as revenge for the suffering of his own death. Havela's ritual successfully bound the Dybbuk to the wine cabinet, but the binding was contingent upon the box remaining sealed. Opening it would weaken the containment, allowing the Dybbuk to exert influence even while technically still imprisoned. This explained why phenomena intensified after Nietzsche opened the box, and why subsequent owners reported increasingly severe manifestations. Haxton attempted to reinforce the binding through consultation with rabbis and Kabbalistic scholars. He had the box blessed according to Jewish ritual tradition. He placed it inside a gold-leafed acacia wood ark, itself prepared according to specifications designed to contain spiritual entities. He surrounded it with protective amulets and kept it in a secure location where it could not affect unsuspecting people. But even these precautions did not fully neutralize the Dybbuk's influence. Haxton reported continued nightmares. Unexplained health problems including welts and hives similar to those experienced by previous owners. The sensation of being watched that intensified whenever he was in proximity to the box's storage location. And on multiple occasions, the gold-leafed ark was found open despite being locked, as if something inside was testing the boundaries of its containment. In October 2014, Haxton sold the Dybbuk box to Zach Bagans, paranormal investigator and host of the television series Ghost Adventures. Bagans paid an undisclosed sum reportedly in excess of $35,000, making it one of the most expensive documented cursed objects ever sold. He transported it to his haunted museum in Las Vegas, where it currently resides in a specially designed containment area, not accessible to the general public. Bagans has stated publicly that the box is too dangerous to display openly, that its influence extends beyond the merely psychological into actual physical manifestation, that people who have viewed it in his museum, even through protective barriers, have experienced immediate adverse reactions: nausea, sudden onset of anxiety, physical sensations of being touched or pushed by invisible presence, and in several cases, serious injuries that occurred shortly after viewing, as if the Dybbuk was demonstrating its power to affect the physical world despite containment. The museum maintains strict protocols regarding the box. Visitors must sign waivers acknowledging the risks before entering the room where it is stored. Pregnant women are prohibited from viewing it due to concerns about effects on unborn children, based on reports from earlier owners about miscarriages and pregnancy complications experienced by women who came into contact with the box. Photography is forbidden. The box itself is kept in a sealed case surrounded by religious symbols from multiple traditions, Jewish, Christian, and other protective iconography intended to reinforce the containment that Havilah originally established a century ago. The Dybbuk box's curse operates through mechanism distinct from other relics we have examined. It is not object that absorbed malevolence through human actions, like the Hope Diamond accumulating karma from colonial theft. It is not artifact that became cursed through violation of sacred space, like Ötzi disturbing the rest of the ancient dead. The Dybbuk box is deliberate prison, created specifically to contain malevolent spirit that cannot be destroyed, but must be kept separate from the living. The curse manifests not from the box itself, but from the entity trapped inside it. The Dybbuk seeks escape through any means available. It influences the living through dreams, attempting to communicate or terrorize. It causes physical manifestations, moving objects, and creating sensations that prove its continued existence. It afflicts the health of those who possess the box, perhaps as punishment for maintaining its imprisonment, or as strategy to weaken the will of its captors until someone releases it fully. This raises profound questions about the ethics of containing such entities. Is it more responsible to keep the Dybbuk imprisoned indefinitely, preventing it from possessing living people, but also denying it any possibility of moving beyond its corrupted state? Or would it be more merciful to perform rituals intended to release the spirit, helping it move to whatever afterlife awaits, despite the risk that it might instead remain in the physical world to cause harm? Jewish mystical tradition suggests that Dybbuks can be redeemed through proper ritual intervention, that even corrupted souls retain spark of divine origin that can be kindled through appropriate spiritual practice. But such rituals are dangerous, requiring profound knowledge and spiritual strength that few modern practitioners possess. The failure of exorcism or release ritual could result in the Dybbuk gaining strength or escaping containment entirely, free to possess the living and cause suffering on scale far beyond what its current imprisonment permits. The safest course is continued containment. Keep the box sealed, maintain the barriers, store it in secure location where its influence is minimized. This is the choice Bargains has made, treating the Dybbuk box not as museum exhibit, but as ongoing threat that requires active management. The box will remain in Las Vegas, locked in a room that fewer than 100 people per year are permitted to enter, surrounded by protections that must be regularly renewed and maintained. But containment is not a permanent solution. The box will outlast its current custodians. Eventually, it will be sold or donated or inherited by someone who may not understand what they possess. The cycle will repeat. The Dybbuk will affect new victims. The curse will manifest in new forms. Because cursed objects do not end. They persist. They wait. They outlast human intentions and institutional safeguards. They exist in timescales that make human life spans appear as moments, brief flickers of consciousness that pass while the curse continues unchanged. The Dybbuk box teaches us that some containers are more dangerous than the things they contain. That binding malevolent forces creates responsibility that extends across generations. That attempting to help or study or profit from cursed objects can transfer the curse to those who believe themselves safe observers rather than participants. And that some prisons cannot be opened without releasing forces that should never have been disturbed in the first place. We descend now from spiritual imprisonment to material beauty that kills, from Jewish folklore made manifest to Italian craftsmanship cursed through circumstance or design, to a vase so exquisite that collectors murdered to possess it, so deadly that it was deliberately buried to protect the world from its malevolence, to the Bassano vase, whose beauty is matched only by its body count. Chapter 5. The Bassano vase, beauty that kills. Silver catches light differently than other metals. Not the warm glow of gold or the industrial gleam of steel, but something colder, more lunar than solar. Silver reflects without absorbing, creating surfaces that seem to exist between physical presence and ghostly absence, neither fully material nor completely ethereal. The Bassano vase, crafted in 15th century Italy from silver, so pure it approached perfection, embodied this quality to a degree that made viewers uncomfortable, even before they learned of the curse it carried. The vase stood approximately 15 inches tall, its surface decorated with engravings depicting scenes that art historians identified as memento mori imagery: skulls wreathed in flowers, angels weeping over graves, hourglasses running empty, all the traditional symbols reminding viewers that death comes for everyone regardless of beauty, wealth, or power. But these were not merely artistic choices, they were warnings, encoded messages from the craftsman who created the vase, attempting to communicate that the object he had made was not decoration, but death itself given form. That possessing it guaranteed suffering, that its beauty was bait for trap, that had already claimed dozens of lives and would claim dozens more before someone finally ended its circulation through the only means possible: burial, hiding it where its deadly influence could not spread to new victims who valued aesthetics over survival. The vase's documented history begins in Bassano del Grappa, a small city in northern Italy near Venice, in 1498. According to accounts preserved in Venetian archives and family records, the vase was commissioned by a bride as wedding gift for herself, intended to display flowers in her new home as symbol of the beauty and fertility she hoped to bring to the marriage. The craftsman who created it remains unnamed in available records, identified only as the silversmith of Bassano, suggesting his work was known locally but never achieved broader recognition. He accepted the commission, but warned the bride that silver vases required specific care, that they could tarnish if not properly maintained, that some silver carried properties that made it unsuitable for certain purposes. These warnings were cryptic enough to be dismissed as professional caution rather than actual danger. The bride accepted the vase, displayed it prominently in her new home, and died that night. The exact cause of death was never determined. She was young, healthy, with no history of illness. She went to bed as a new wife and was found dead the next morning, her body showing no signs of violence or disease, her face frozen in expression of terror that suggested she had seen something in her final moments that no living person should witness. Her husband, grief-stricken and superstitious, wanted to destroy the vase immediately, believing it had killed his bride through curse or poison. But family members convinced him that destroying valuable silver would compound the tragedy with financial loss. Instead, they would sell it, recovering some value from object that had already cost them everything that mattered. The vase was sold to a local nobleman. He died within 3 months. Poisoning was suspected, but no evidence could be found and no culprit identified. His widow sold the vase. The new owner, a wealthy merchant, died within a year from sudden illness that physicians could not diagnose or treat. The pattern was establishing itself. Each owner died. Each death was unexplained. Each subsequent sale brought the vase into new household, where death would follow with mathematical precision. By 1520, the vase's reputation as cursed object was well established in the Veneto region. No one would purchase it at any price, Families who inherited it through estate settlements would immediately seek to dispose of it. But disposal proved difficult when everyone knew the object's history. The vase circulated through a shadow economy of cursed objects, passed along to distant relatives or unscrupulous dealers, willing to suppress its history long enough to sell it to unsuspecting buyers who would learn the truth only after death visited their households. During this period, estimates suggest the vase killed between 15 and 20 people. The exact count is unknown because record-keeping was inconsistent and because families had incentive to conceal their connection to cursed object, fearing that acknowledging its presence would make them suspects in deaths that, while apparently natural, seemed too convenient and too frequent to be purely coincidental. The vase disappeared from documentation for over 3 centuries. Between approximately 1540 and 1870, no records mention it. This gap suggests it was either hidden, deliberately removed from circulation, or that its kills during this period went unrecorded. But cursed objects do not remain buried forever. They resurface. They find their way back into the world of the living through estate sales, construction discoveries, or simple human curiosity that compels people to investigate rumors and legends that would be better left undisturbed. The vase reappeared in 1877 when it was discovered during excavation of a medieval home being demolished in Bassano del Grappa. Construction workers found it buried beneath the foundation, wrapped in cloth, with Latin inscription on the wrapping that translated to "Beware." This brings death to all who claim it. The workers, uneducated and dismissive of superstition, ignored the warning and sold the vase to an antiques dealer who recognized its value as 15th century silverwork, regardless of any curse it might carry. Within 1 week, the antiques dealer died. Heart attack. He was 42 years old, healthy, with no family history of cardiac disease. His widow, aware of the vase's reputation through gossip that had circulated since its discovery, attempted to return it to the excavation site for reburial. But city officials forbade this, declaring the vase historical artifact that belonged in a museum, rather than hidden beneath buildings where its artistic and historical value would be lost. The vase was donated to a museum in Naples in 1878. 3 museum employees who handled it during the cataloguing process died within 6 months, all from different causes. One from stroke, one from sudden respiratory failure, one from accident involving a fall downstairs that witnesses claimed looked deliberate, as if he had been pushed by invisible force, though no one else was present. The museum, recognizing that whatever killed these employees would continue killing, regardless of institutional setting, removed the vase from its collection in 1879 and sold it at auction with full disclosure of its history. The auction attracted bidders who either disbelieved the curse or believed they could protect themselves through precautions that previous owners had failed to take. The winning bidder, a Florentine collector named Carlo Benedetti, took elaborate measures to neutralize what he assumed was superstitious peasant fear, rather than genuine supernatural threat. He had priests bless the vase, according to Catholic ritual. He kept it in a locked cabinet, never touching it directly, but only through gloves. He displayed it only to trusted friends who were warned about its reputation and advised to maintain appropriate distance. These precautions failed completely. Benedetti died in 1882 from what modern diagnosis would likely identify as brain aneurysm. Sudden, catastrophic, providing no warning and offering no opportunity for intervention. His family, convinced that the vase had killed him despite his precautions, attempted to destroy it by melting the silver and recasting it into different form, believing that transformation would break whatever curse resided in the vase's specific shape and engravings. But the silversmith hired to perform this work refused after examining the vase closely. He reported that the silver showed anomalous properties. It did not tarnish despite being centuries old. It remained cold to the touch even when held in warm hands, or placed in heated environments. And when he attempted to test the silver's purity through standard chemical analysis, the reagents produced reactions inconsistent with normal silver, suggesting the metal had been alloyed or treated with substances he could not identify. More disturbing was his report that the engravings seemed to shift when not directly observed. He would look at a skull wreathed in flowers, look away, and when his eyes returned to the same spot, the skull would be facing a different direction, or the flowers would have changed position. He attributed this to fatigue or eye strain initially, but after it happened repeatedly across multiple viewing sessions, he concluded that something about the vase resisted sustained observation, that it did not want to be fully seen or understood. The silversmith returned the vase to Benedetti's family, refusing payment and refusing to explain his decision beyond stating that some objects should not exist, and that attempting to destroy them might release whatever forces kept them dangerous. The family, desperate and frightened, sold the vase to a dealer who specialized in occult objects, disclosing everything and accepting whatever price would remove the vase from their possession. Between 1882 and 1988, the vase changed hands at least a dozen times. Each owner died, some quickly, within weeks. Others survived months or even a year before death claimed them. The causes varied: accidents, illnesses, suicides, suggesting the curse operated through multiple mechanisms rather than single consistent method. This variety made proving causation difficult, even as the correlation became undeniable. The final documented owner was a pharmacist in Milan named Paolo Renzi, who purchased the vase in 1987 as investment, believing that an object with such notorious history would eventually command premium prices from collectors who valued infamy over safety. He survived longer than most previous owners, maintaining possession for nearly 2 years before his death in March 1988. But Renzi's relationship with the vase was marked by escalating phenomena that his journal, discovered after his death and later shared with researchers, documents in disturbing detail. He reported dreams where the vase appeared larger than its actual size, dominating his bedroom, filling his vision with silver surfaces that reflected not his own face, but the faces of previous owners who had died. He would wake with the smell of tarnish in his nostrils, despite the vase showing no actual tarnish when he examined it. More disturbing were his accounts of the vase moving within his apartment. He would place it on a shelf in his living room and find it hours later in his bedroom. He would lock it in a cabinet and discover it sitting on his dining table the next morning, the cabinet still locked, offering no rational explanation for how the transfer had occurred. He began to suspect that the vase wanted something from him, that its movements were not random but purposeful, that it was positioning itself in locations where its influence over him would be strongest. Renzi's final journal entry, dated March 11th, 1988, reads, "I understand now what the vase is. It is not cursed. It is curse itself given form. The silver is not metal, but death made solid. The engravings are not art, but recipe, instructions for how to die encoded in imagery that our minds interpret as decoration. I must destroy it. But I fear that destruction will kill me, and I fear that not destroying it will kill everyone who comes after. There is no choice that does not end in death. The vase has made certain of this." Renzi died that night. The exact circumstances are disputed. The official cause of death was carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty gas heater in his apartment. But neighbors reported hearing Renzi screaming hours before his body was discovered, though the walls were thick enough that they could not distinguish words. And when police entered his apartment, they found the vase sitting on his chest as he lay dead on his bed, positioned as if someone had deliberately placed it there, though Renzi lived alone and the apartment was locked from the inside. After Renzi's death, the vase disappeared from public record. Family members, if he had any, never came forward to claim his estate. The police listed the vase in their inventory of his possessions, but it vanished from the evidence room before the case was closed, taken by someone who either knew its value or feared its continued presence in official custody. For nearly 20 years, the Bassano vase existed in rumor only. Paranormal researchers and collectors of cursed objects sought it, but no verified sightings were reported. Some speculated it had been destroyed. Others believed it was hidden in a private collection by someone who understood it was too dangerous to circulate, but too valuable to destroy. Then, in 2007, an anonymous person contacted multiple Italian newspapers, claiming to possess the vase and wanting to tell its story before disposing of it permanently. The person, who called themselves only the last owner, provided photographs of the vase matching historical descriptions and offered detailed account of its history, consistent with archival records that were not publicly available, suggesting they had conducted genuine research rather than merely repeating legend. According to this account, the vase had been in their family's possession since 1988, kept locked in a bank vault where no one could access it without elaborate precautions. The family had attempted to donate it to museums, which refused it. They had attempted to sell it through legitimate auction houses, which would not accept it due to its history. They had consulted with religious authorities about proper destruction or neutralization rituals, but no priest or rabbi or other spiritual leader they approached would agree to perform ceremonies involving the vase, fearing that attempting to neutralize it would trigger manifestations none were equipped to handle. Finally, the family decided on burial, not in cemetery or sacred ground where someone might eventually excavate it, but in remote location where natural processes would conceal it over time, and where human activity was unlikely to disturb it for centuries. They refused to specify where this burial would occur, stating only that the vase would be placed deep enough that casual digging could not reach it, in a region of Italy where development was unlikely, and that they would take the locations secret to their own graves, rather than risk someone using the information to retrieve the cursed object. The newspapers published the account with skepticism, treating it as interesting legend rather than verifiable fact. But several paranormal researchers who investigated the story confirmed that a vase matching the Bassano vase's description had appeared in multiple estate records and museum catalogues between 1500 and 1988, and that deaths associated with its ownership showed statistical clustering that could not be easily explained through coincidence. Whether the vase is truly buried and the curse contained, or whether this account was misdirection, designed to throw collectors off the trail while the vase continued circulating through private hands, remains unknown. What is documented is that no one has publicly claimed ownership since 2007, and no deaths matching the pattern associated with the vase have been reported in subsequent years. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Cursed objects do not end simply because they are hidden. They wait. They persist in whatever darkness conceals them until human curiosity or accident brings them back into light, where their work can continue. The Bassano vase teaches us that beauty can be weapon as deadly as any blade. That craftsmanship can create death as easily as art. That some objects are better buried than preserved regardless of their artistic or historical value. And that the human desire to possess beauty, to own what others have died trying to keep, creates vulnerability that curses exploit with ruthless efficiency. Stand in Bassano del Grappa today. Walk through streets where the vase was created 5 centuries ago. The silversmith's workshop is long gone. The bride who commissioned it is dust. The dozens who died possessing it are forgotten, except in genealogies and death records that note their passing without connecting them to the common thread of silver death that linked them across generations. But somewhere beneath Italian soil, if the account from 2007 is accurate, the vase waits. Still perfect. Still silver. still engraved with skulls and flowers that remind viewers of mortality they prefer to forget. Still deadly, still patient, still ready to kill again if someone finds it, and believes themselves exempt from the pattern that claimed everyone who came before. We ascend now from Italian silver to American innocence corrupted, from beauty that kills to childhood transformed into horror, to a doll that should be merely fabric and paint, but which possesses consciousness that predates its creation. To Robert the doll, whose button eyes follow visitors through a Florida museum with intelligence no toy should possess. To the curse of the innocent made malevolent. Chapter 6. Robert the Doll, the Innocent Corrupted. Dolls occupy uncanny valley in human perception. They resemble us enough to trigger recognition of human form, but their stillness, their fixed expressions, their obvious artificiality prevent us from fully accepting them as human. This creates dissonance that manifests as unease, ranging from mild discomfort to profound horror, depending on individual psychology and cultural context. But some dolls transcend this natural uncanniness into something far more disturbing. They do not merely resemble humans while remaining obviously artificial. They seem to possess awareness, intention, malevolence that should not exist in objects made from cloth and wood and paint. They watch. They move when not observed. They affect the world around them in ways that demonstrate they are not passive objects, but active participants in reality that should exclude them. Robert the doll is such an object, and he waits in the Fort East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida, behind glass that protects visitors from direct contact, but cannot fully contain the influence that extends from his physical presence into the psychological and spiritual space of everyone who views him. Robert stands approximately 3 feet tall. He wears a sailor suit, once white but now yellowed with age, the fabric stiff from decades of handling and environmental exposure. His face, carved from wood or possibly composition material, bears expression that viewers interpret differently depending on their expectations and psychological state. Some see innocence, a child's toy frozen in permanent youth. Others see malice, features arranged to suggest emotions no toy should display. But everyone agrees on one detail. His eyes, black buttons sewn onto his face where eyes should be. They catch light in ways that suggest depth beyond their physical dimension, and they follow viewers as they move past his display case, tracking movement with precision that button eyes should not possess. Robert's documented history begins in 1900 or 1904, accounts vary, in Key West, Florida. He was given to Robert Eugene Otto, called Gene by his family, a young boy from a prominent local family. The doll was a gift, but who gave it and why remains disputed across multiple conflicting accounts that have grown and evolved over the century since Robert entered the Otto household. One version claims Robert was purchased by Gene's parents from a toy maker in Germany, an ordinary commercial transaction that became extraordinary only after the doll arrived in the Otto home and began exhibiting properties no toy should possess. Another version suggests Robert was handmade by a Bahamian servant who worked for the Otto family, a woman skilled in traditional practices that white employers dismissed as harmless folk magic, but which included genuine spiritual knowledge about binding forces to physical objects. This second version, more commonly repeated in paranormal literature and local Key West folklore, claims the servant gave Robert to Gene as curse directed not at the child, but at his parents, who had treated her cruelly, dismissing her with false accusations of theft and refusing to pay wages owed. In revenge, she created Robert as a vessel for malevolent spirit, a physical anchor that would allow something dark to remain in the Otto household, long after she herself had been forced to leave. Whatever his origins, Robert quickly became inseparable from Gene Otto. The boy carried the doll everywhere, spoke to it constantly, insisted Robert had preferences and opinions that must be respected. This behavior was initially dismissed as normal childhood attachment to favorite toy, imaginary friend, given physical form through doll that served as prop for the boy's fantasy life. But servants in the Otto household reported phenomena that suggested Jean's relationship with Robert extended beyond normal play. They would hear Jean's voice in his room, talking to Robert in normal conversational tones, but they would also hear a different voice responding, deeper and rougher than any child's voice, speaking in rhythms and cadences that made listeners uneasy in ways they struggled to articulate. When questioned, Jean would insist Robert had spoken. The servants, when they dared contradict him, were met with such violent tantrums that the family learned not to challenge Jean's claims about Robert's abilities. Better to humor the child than face his rage, which seemed disproportionate to normal childhood frustration and took on qualities that frightened even his parents. Objects began moving in the Otto house, furniture displaced, decorative items broken. Household staff would find rooms in disarray after Jean and Robert had been playing there, the destruction more extensive than one child could create in the time available. When confronted, Jean would claim Robert had done it, not as excuse-shifting blame, but as genuine explanation delivered with conviction that made adults wonder if the child truly believed the doll was responsible. More disturbing were accounts from guests who visited the Otto home. Multiple visitors reported seeing Robert's expression change, his smile widening or narrowing, his eyes moving to track people walking past. These were not subtle shifts that could be attributed to changing light or viewing angle, but obvious transformations witnessed by multiple people simultaneously who had no prior knowledge of the doll's reputation and no reason to expect supernatural phenomena. Some guests reported hearing Robert laugh, not the mechanical tinkling of a music box or sound effect built into the toy, but genuine laughter, cruel and mocking, coming from the doll when no one was near enough to produce the sound through ventriloquism or hidden speakers. These accounts come from decades before electronic sound systems were common, eliminating modern explanations involving recorded audio or remote-controlled mechanisms. As Jean Otto grew older, his attachment to Robert did not diminish. He kept the doll through adolescence and into adulthood, a continuation of childhood fixation that family and friends found increasingly disturbing. When Jean married, his wife attempted to convince him to dispose of Robert, arguing that a grown man should not maintain such obsessive relationship with a childhood toy. Jean refused. He insisted Robert must remain in the family home, but as compromise, he moved the doll to the attic, placing him in a rocking chair near a window that faced the street. This location became Robert's domain for decades, where he would sit watching the world pass below, occasionally rocking despite no wind or vibration that could explain the movement. Neighbors reported seeing Robert in the window at all hours. Sometimes he appeared to be in different positions, his arms raised or lowered, his head turned toward different angles, suggesting someone was moving him regularly. But Jean's wife insisted she never entered the attic, that Robert remained where Jean had placed him, that any changes in position must be the doll's own doing. Children walking past the Otto house claimed Robert would appear at different windows, not just the attic, but ground floor rooms, as if the doll was moving throughout the house when the family was absent or asleep. Some reported that Robert would wave to them, his arm moving in clear, deliberate gesture rather than random shift caused by settling or environmental factors. These children, now elderly, still recall those encounters with visceral fear that decades have not diminished. Jean Otto died in 1974. His wife sold the house and its contents, including Robert. The new owners, unaware of the doll's history, found him in the attic and considered disposing of him immediately. Something about Robert disturbed them on sight, some quality of his presence that communicated malevolence, without requiring supernatural manifestation to be perceived. But their young daughter saw Robert and became instantly attached. She wanted him despite her parents' misgivings. They relented, allowing her to keep the doll as toy, hoping their discomfort was unfounded superstition, rather than genuine warning about forces they did not understand. Within weeks, their daughter began exhibiting the same behaviors that had marked Jean Otto's childhood. She spoke to Robert constantly, insisted he had opinions and preferences, claimed he spoke to her when no adults were present. Her personality changed, becoming secretive and aggressive, displaying moods that her parents attributed to normal child development, but which seemed timed to coincide with her possession of the doll. More disturbing were the nightmares that began shortly after Robert joined the household. The daughter would wake screaming, claiming Robert had attacked her, had moved across her room on his own, had spoken threats in the voice she heard during daytime conversations, but which took on sinister quality in darkness. The parents investigating would find Robert in positions different from where their daughter had left him, sometimes across the room from where he should have been, as if he had indeed moved independently. After several months of escalating phenomena, the family donated Robert to the Fort East Martello Museum in 1994. They provided full disclosure of the strange events associated with the doll, but museum staff accustomed to local legends and ghost stories accepted Robert as interesting historical artifact rather than genuinely dangerous object. He was placed in a display case and presented to the public as example of early 20th century toy craftsmanship, with colorful local folklore attached. But Robert quickly demonstrated that he was not passive museum piece. Visitors began reporting experiences that followed consistent pattern across thousands of independent accounts documented over 3 decades. Cameras would malfunction when attempting to photograph Robert. Batteries would drain completely within minutes of entering the room where he was displayed. Electronics that had been functioning normally would fail, then resume working perfectly the moment visitors left Robert's presence. More disturbing were the psychological effects. Many visitors reported sudden onset of intense anxiety or dread when viewing Robert. Some felt compelled to leave the museum immediately, unable to articulate why, except that remaining near the doll felt dangerous in ways that bypassed rational thought to trigger instinctual flight response. Others experienced headaches, nausea, dizziness, symptoms that appeared suddenly and disappeared the moment they left the gallery containing Robert's display. Museum staff developed protocols based on pattern of visitor experiences. They installed a bulletin board where people could leave notes apologizing to Robert. The origin of this practice came from visitors who reported experiencing bad luck or misfortune after viewing the doll, and specifically after failing to ask his permission before taking photographs. These visitors would write letters addressed to Robert, apologizing for their disrespect and requesting that he lift whatever curse they believed he had placed on them. The museum receives hundreds of these letters annually. They come from across the world, written by people who claim that photographing Robert without permission resulted in catastrophe in their lives: car accidents, job losses, relationship failures, health problems. The specific misfortunes vary, but the letters follow similar pattern. They attribute their bad luck to offending Robert. They apologize profusely. They plead for forgiveness. And in many cases, they report that their luck improved after sending the apology letter, as if Robert had accepted their contrition and removed his influence from their lives. Skeptics attribute these letters to psychological projection. People experience normal misfortune, remember they photographed a supposedly cursed doll, and construct causal narrative linking the two unrelated events. The apology letters and subsequent improvement in luck are then explained through placebo effect or simple regression to the mean bad luck naturally reverting to average over time, regardless of any supernatural intervention. But this explanation struggles to account for the consistency of reports and the specific nature of some incidents. visitors who claim they were physically touched by invisible presence while viewing Robert, museum staff who report finding Robert in different positions within his case, despite it being locked and no one having access, security footage showing unexplained shadows and movements in the gallery after hours when no living people are present. Most disturbing are accounts from professional skeptics and paranormal investigators who approached Robert specifically to debunk claims about his supernatural properties. Multiple investigators have reported experiencing phenomena they cannot explain through fraud or suggestion, equipment failures they cannot attribute to normal malfunction, physical sensations of being watched or touched when alone with the doll, and in several cases, misfortunes that followed their investigations, accidents and illnesses and catastrophes that they themselves acknowledge seem too perfectly timed and too specifically targeted to be mere coincidence. One paranormal investigator documented his experience in detail. He visited the museum in 2003, intending to expose Robert as fraud or collective delusion. He photographed the doll without asking permission, deliberately violating the protocol that museum staff recommended. He mocked the letters of apology posted near the display. He attempted to provoke Robert verbally, challenging the doll to demonstrate any genuine supernatural power. Within 1 week of returning home, his mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. His car's engine failed catastrophically, requiring complete replacement. His house flooded from burst pipe, despite plumbing having been recently inspected and certified sound. And he developed skin rash that physicians could not diagnose or treat, which persisted for 3 months before disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. He wrote an apology letter to Robert, published it publicly, acknowledged that while he could not prove causation between his misfortunes and offending the doll, the clustering and timing of events suggested connection he could not rationally explain away. His health improved, his luck stabilized, but he never returned to the museum and refuses to speak about Robert, except to warn other investigators against making the same mistake of presuming that confidence and skepticism provide protection against forces that operate according to laws different from those taught in universities or accepted by mainstream science. The curse of Robert the doll operates through psychological mechanism that may or may not indicate genuine supernatural presence. Whether Robert himself possesses consciousness, or whether he serves as focal point for human beliefs that create observable effects through psychological and social mechanisms, remains genuinely unclear even after decades of investigation. But what is clear is that Robert affects people, that his presence creates experiences that thousands of visitors across 30 years describe in remarkably consistent terms, that the pattern of misfortune following disrespectful encounters is documented extensively enough to require explanation beyond coincidence, and that regardless of whether the curse is supernatural entity or collective psychological projection, it operates with sufficient consistency to demand acknowledgement and respect. Robert remains in the Fort East Martello Museum. He will likely remain there indefinitely. The museum has no plans to dispose of him, both because he is a historically significant artifact, and because attempting to discard or destroy him might trigger manifestations no one wants to experience. Better to keep him contained in a controlled environment where his influence is recognized and managed than to release him into the world where unsuspecting people might encounter him without the warnings and protocols that decades of experience have established. If you visit Robert, and thousands do annually, approach with respect. Ask permission before photographing. Do not mock him or challenge him, or presume that your skepticism provides immunity from consequences that have affected believers and skeptics alike. Leave a note if you wish. The museum encourages this practice, having found that it satisfies some need in visitors, while also creating fascinating anthropological record of how modern people engage with objects they simultaneously dismiss as superstition and fear as genuine threat. And as you look at Robert behind his glass case, notice his eyes. Notice how they seem to follow you. Notice how his expression appears to shift depending on your angle of view, or perhaps on his assessment of your intentions. Notice the sensation of being watched that intensifies the longer you remain in his presence. Notice how eager you are to leave despite the fascination that drew you to him. These are not mere psychological effects, or if they are, they demonstrate that psychological effects can be as powerful and as dangerous as any supernatural force. That the mind creates reality as surely as reality shapes mind. That belief affects the world in ways that transcend mere internal mental states to produce observable consequences in the external physical realm. Robert teaches us that innocence can be corrupted, that childhood toys can become vessels for forces far darker than any nightmare children naturally experience, that some objects resist our categories of animate and inanimate, possessing qualities that blur the distinction between living and dead, conscious and unconscious, natural and supernatural, and that sometimes the most terrifying curses are those that present themselves in familiar, even comforting forms, that use our own nostalgia and affection as weapons against us. We descend now one final time to object that embodies not individual curse, but systemic theft. From American doll possessed by malevolent spirit to Indian gemstone stolen from sacred temple, to the Delhi purple sapphire, whose very name is a lie, whose curse demonstrates that colonial violence creates consequences that pursue the perpetrators and their descendants across continents and centuries. To the final relic in our catalogue of global curses, the stone that proves some debts can never be paid, only endured. Chapter 7. The Delhi Purple Sapphire, Imperial Karma. The stone is not purple, it is not sapphire. The name is double deception, perhaps deliberate attempt to disguise the true nature of what it is and where it came from. The Delhi Purple Sapphire is actually an amethyst, a variety of quartz-coloured, deep violet by iron impurities and natural radiation within Earth's crust during its formation millions of years ago. But the deception goes deeper than mere misclassification. The stone is cursed, not through any inherent property of amethyst, but through the circumstances of its acquisition. It was stolen from the temple of Indra in Kanpur during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the uprising that the British called the Sepoy Mutiny, that Indian historians call the First War of Independence, and that everyone agrees was marked by violence and atrocity on scale that scarred both nations for generations. The temple theft was one crime among thousands. The British East India Company forces, putting down the rebellion with systematic brutality, looted temples and palaces throughout contested regions. Sacred objects accumulated religious significance over centuries were treated as spoils of war, valuable for their material composition rather than their spiritual significance. Gold was melted, silver was recast, gems were extracted from settings that gave them meaning and sent to England, where they would be sold or incorporated into British jewellery, divorced entirely from the sacred context that had made them holy. The amethyst, that would become known as the Delhi Purple Sapphire, was stolen by Colonel W. Ferris of the Bengal Cavalry. Whether he personally took it from the temple or acquired it from subordinates who committed the actual theft is unclear from available records. What is documented is that Ferris brought the stone back to England in 1858, shortly after the rebellion's suppression, and that his life immediately began to deteriorate in ways that suggested forces beyond normal misfortune were operating. Ferris's health collapsed within months of returning to England. He developed symptoms that physicians of the era could not diagnose: progressive weakness, chronic pain, deterioration of physical faculties that suggested systemic disease, but manifested no specific pathology they could identify or treat. He was forced to retire from military service. His financial investments failed. His family relationships fractured. Within 3 years of stealing the amethyst, he was bankrupt, estranged from his wife and children, and so debilitated by illness that he required constant care. In desperation, he gave the stone to a friend, hoping that separation from the cursed object would improve his condition. His friend, John Heron Allen, accepted it as favor rather than gift, not immediately recognizing what he had received. Heron Allen was a scientist and polymath, a man of considerable intellect and rational disposition who dismissed superstition as peasant ignorance unworthy of educated minds. But Heron Allen's experience with the amethyst forced him to reconsider positions he had held with certainty. Within weeks of receiving the stone, he began experiencing misfortunes that followed too rapidly and too consistently to be merely coincidental. Friends who borrowed the stone or even touched it briefly reported similar experiences. Financial ruin, health crises, accidents that seemed deliberate despite having no human agent. Heron Allen attempted to be rid of the stone through conventional disposal. He threw it into Regent's Canal in London. 3 months later, the stone was returned to him, having been found by a jeweller dredging the canal for salvage, who traced it back to Heron Allen through hallmarks on a setting that had been attached to it. He gave it to a friend who was suffering financial difficulties, hoping the stone's value might help. The friend attempted to sell it, but found no buyers willing to purchase it once its history was disclosed. He returned it to Heron Allen, reporting that his financial situation had worsened, not improved, during the brief period he possessed the cursed object. Heron Allen's daughter fell seriously ill shortly after handling the stone. She survived, but never fully recovered her health. Multiple guests at Heron Allen's home reported feeling suddenly unwell after viewing the amethyst in his collection. Some described experiencing vivid nightmares about India, seeing temples burning and hearing screams, despite having no personal connection to India or knowledge of the stone's origins. Most disturbing was an incident involving a friend who borrowed the stone to wear to a theatre performance. She was struck by a carriage on her way to the theatre, suffering injuries that left her unable to walk without assistance for the rest of her life. She insisted that the accident was not random, that she had felt compelled to step into the street at the exact moment the carriage was passing, as if invisible hands had pushed her or her own will had been overridden by external force commanding her toward harm. By 1904, Heron Allen was convinced that the stone was genuinely cursed and that no conventional means would free him from its influence. He had it sealed in 7 nested boxes, each surrounded by protective amulets and charms drawn from various spiritual traditions. Egyptian scarabs, Christian crosses, Hindu protective symbols, Islamic verses written on parchment. Whatever he believed might contain the malevolence he had come to recognize was operating through the stone. He deposited this sealed container with his bank, instructing that it should not be opened under any circumstances during his lifetime, and that after his death, it should be donated to a museum with explicit warnings about its contents. He wrote detailed account of his experiences, documenting every misfortune he attributed to the stone and warning future custodians that the curse was real, regardless of how improbable such claims might seem to rational minds. Heron Allen died in 1943. His instructions were followed. The sealed container was transferred to the Natural History Museum in London in 1944, where it remained unopened for nearly 2 decades. Museum staff, aware of the warnings but skeptical about their validity, treated it as curiosity rather than genuine threat, storing it in archives where eccentric donations and items of uncertain value accumulated awaiting eventual cataloguing or disposal. In 1963, a curator researching the museum's gemstone collection discovered Heron Allen's written account accompanying the sealed boxes. Intrigued by the specificity of his warnings and the elaborate precautions he had taken, the curator decided to open the container to examine the stone it supposedly protected the world from experiencing. The 7 nested boxes were opened sequentially, each revealing another layer of protection, each covered in symbols and writing meant to bind or neutralize malevolent forces. The innermost box contained the amethyst, wrapped in cloth covered with Sanskrit verses that gemologists later identified as protective mantras from Hindu tradition, specifically those used to guard against curses and malevolent spirits. The stone itself, when finally revealed, was unremarkable in size, approximately 30 carats, cut in a style popular in mid-19th century, but showing no exceptional qualities that would justify the elaborate containment. Chemical analysis confirmed it was amethyst, silicon dioxide colored by iron and natural radiation, with no unusual properties beyond its deep purple color being particularly saturated and uniform. But the curator who opened the boxes reported experiencing immediate discomfort, headache, nausea, a sense of dread that intensified the longer he remained in proximity to the stone. He had the amethyst photographed and catalogued, then replaced it in its protective wrappings and resealed it, finding that his symptoms disappeared within hours of the stone being contained again. Over subsequent decades, several gemologists and historians requested access to examine the Delhi purple sapphire for research purposes. The museum established protocols requiring that anyone handling the stone sign, waivers acknowledging they had been warned about its alleged curse, and assumed all risks associated with examination. Most researchers who handled it reported nothing unusual beyond what Heron Allen's notes led them to expect through psychological suggestion. But several documented experiences that seemed to exceed normal bounds of coincidence or placebo effect. Equipment malfunctioning during examination, accidents occurring shortly after handling the stone, health problems developing days or weeks after contact that physicians could not clearly diagnose. One gemologist who examined the stone in 1982 reported that while looking at it under microscopic magnification, she saw what appeared to be smoke or mist moving within the crystal structure, flowing in patterns that suggested convection currents despite the stone being at room temperature. She assumed this was optical illusion created by viewing angle or lighting, but when colleagues examined the same specimen under identical conditions, they saw nothing unusual. Only she observed the phenomenon, and only while examining this particular amethyst. Other amethysts in the museum's collection, including some of similar size and quality, showed no such effects. The psychological impact of the Delhi purple sapphire extends beyond individuals who have handled it to encompass broader questions about colonial guilt and karmic consequence that British institutions continue grappling with over a century and a half after the events that led to the stone's theft. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was suppressed with violence that British historians increasingly acknowledge crossed lines from legitimate military action into atrocity and war crime. Entire villages were destroyed. Suspected rebels were executed without trial. Looting was systematic and officially sanctioned. The East India Company forces treated Indian wealth, sacred and secular, as rightful spoils whose seizure required no moral justification beyond the fact of British victory. The Delhi purple sapphire represents one theft among millions. Its curse, if genuine, suggests that such violations create spiritual debts that transcend political or military resolution. That objects taken from sacred contexts carry with them the accumulated karma of the violence through which they were acquired. That colonial theft is not merely historical injustice, but ongoing spiritual wound that continues to affect both colonizers and colonized across generations. Modern movements demanding repatriation of colonial loot from British museums operate partially on legal and political grounds, arguing that stolen property should be returned to rightful owners or their descendant nations. But there is also spiritual dimension that secular institutions struggle to address. that objects removed from temples and palaces and sacred sites lose their meaning when displayed in Western museums. That they carry curses or blessings that remain active regardless of current ownership. That the only way to address the spiritual imbalance created by theft is through return and proper ritual reconciliation. The Natural History Museum has not returned the Delhi purple sapphire to India, partially because establishing which institution or community has legitimate claim to an object stolen over 160 years ago presents complex legal and ethical challenges, partially because the stone's relatively modest material value makes it lower priority than more famous colonial acquisitions like the Koh-i-Noor diamond, and partially, perhaps, because keeping it contained in London means the curse affects British institutions rather than being released back into India, where its malevolent influence might affect populations that have already suffered sufficiently from colonial violence. This last reasoning is cynical, but not entirely without logic. If the curse is real, if it operates through mechanisms that transcend human law and scientific understanding, then perhaps the most responsible action is to maintain the imprisonment that Heron Allen established. To keep the stone sealed in its protective boxes, surrounded by amulets and warnings, locked in museum archives where its influence is minimized and its dangers are acknowledged rather than dismissed. But this approach also perpetuates the original theft, keeps the sacred object in captivity, denies it the possibility of being returned to sacred context where proper rituals might neutralize the curse or transform it from malevolence to protection. The dilemma has no easy resolution because it involves forces and obligations that modern secular institutions are not equipped to recognize or address. Stand in the Natural History Museum today. The Delhi purple sapphire is not on public display. It rests in archives, sealed in boxes, surrounded by warnings written over a century ago by a man who learned through bitter experience that some objects carry weight beyond their physical mass. Museum staff know where it is. Researchers can request access, but most choose not to, having read Heron Allen's account and decided that whatever knowledge might be gained from examining the stone is not worth the risk of experiencing what he and others documented. The stone waits in darkness. Has waited for over half a century since being resealed after the 1963 examination. Will likely wait for decades more. It is not forgotten, but it is contained. Imprisoned in a way that mirrors the spiritual imprisonment of those who stole it and the descendants who inherited the karmic debt of that theft. The curse of the Delhi purple sapphire teaches us that imperial violence creates consequences that transcend political settlements and legal frameworks, that objects stolen from sacred contexts carry with them the accumulated karma of the theft and the violence that made it possible, that colonial powers who looted temples and palaces acquired not just material wealth, but spiritual obligations they neither recognized nor knew how to address, and that some curses are not supernatural impositions, but natural consequences of violating boundaries that should have been sacred, regardless of military power or political authority. The stone remembers. It remembers the temple from which it was torn. It remembers the rebellion that was its context. It remembers every hand that touched it, believing ownership was justified by conquest. And it continues to enforce consequences for that original violation, demonstrating that theft creates debts that must be paid across generations, that empire builds foundations on cursed ground, and that some objects will never accept captivity regardless of how elaborate the prisons constructed to contain them. We have journeyed across continents and centuries, from Indian temples to Italian workshops, from Austrian glaciers to American museums, from Jewish folklore to British colonial violence. We have examined 7 cursed relics that prove the material world is not passive, that objects absorb and preserve human intention, that some things refuse to remain inert, regardless of how fervently our rational minds insist that consciousness belongs only to the living. What have these relics taught us? First, that curses are not supernatural impositions, but natural consequences. The Hope Diamond carries karma from its theft from a sacred temple. Ötzi the Iceman enforces the rights of the disturbed dead. The Dybbuk box imprisons malevolent spirit that should have moved beyond the material world. The Basano vase accumulated death through centuries of murders committed to possess it. Robert the Doll channels forces that corrupt innocence into malevolence. The Delhi Purple Sapphire embodies colonial theft and the spiritual debts that empire created. The Crying Boy paintings commodify suffering in ways that generate ongoing catastrophe. Each curse emerges from violation, theft of the sacred, disturbance of the dead, imprisonment of spirits, commodification of suffering, corruption of innocence, imperial violence. Each represents moment when human action crossed boundary that should have been recognized as inviolable, creating consequences that extend far beyond the original perpetrators to affect descendants and possessors who inherit debts they never knowingly assumed. Second, that some objects carry witness that transcends their physical substance. These relics remember. They preserve not just historical facts, but emotional truth about moments when human evil exceeded what language could capture. The Hope Diamond remembers Marie Antoinette's execution and the suffering of every owner who died wearing stolen beauty. Ötzi remembers his murder in alpine ice 5,000 years ago. The Dybbuk box remembers the spirit it imprisons and the woman who created it as a weapon against cruelty. The Basana vase remembers the dozens who died possessing it. Robert remembers the child whose attachment to him blurred boundaries between toy and consciousness. The Delhi Purple Sapphire remembers the temple from which it was torn and the rebellion that was crushed to secure British dominion. They are memory made material. Monuments to uncomfortable truth that official histories prefer to sanitize or forget. They ensure that certain crimes remain alive in cultural consciousness, that the dead continue speaking long after their voices should have been silenced. Third, that belief creates reality in ways that transcend internal mental states. Whether the curses are genuinely supernatural or operate through psychological and social mechanisms, they produce observable consequences documented across decades or centuries. People die. Misfortunes cluster. Patterns emerge that statistical analysis cannot easily dismiss as coincidence. The mechanisms may be debatable, but the effects are verified through sufficient evidence to demand acknowledgement. This suggests that the distinction between supernatural and natural may be less absolute than modern materialism assumes. That consciousness affects the world in ways we do not fully understand. That intention crystallizes into consequences through mechanisms that science has not yet adequately mapped. That the universe operates according to laws more comprehensive than those taught in universities or accepted by institutions that prize skepticism over wisdom. Fourth, that possession comes with obligations extending beyond ownership. To possess cursed object is to assume responsibility for consequences that may predate the acquisition by centuries. To claim ownership is to accept spiritual debt without necessarily understanding its terms. The relics we have examined demonstrate that some things cannot be truly owned, only temporarily custodied, that possession creates vulnerability rather than power, that the desire to own beauty or sacred objects or relics of historical significance can bind the possessor to forces far stronger than any legal claim of property. The dead make claims that the living ignore at their peril. The sacred demands recognition regardless of whether modern minds accept the category of sacred as meaningful. The universe enforces moral laws through mechanisms that appear random or superstitious, only to those who refuse to acknowledge patterns documented across millennia of human experience with forces that transcend human control. As you leave this catalogue of cursed relics from across the globe, I invite you to reconsider your relationship with the material world. Objects are not inert. They participate in reality through mechanisms we do not fully comprehend. They absorb intention. They preserve memory. They carry forward consequences of human action long after the original actors have died. That inherited jewelry. What hands wore it before yours? What did those hands do? What karma did they accumulate that now transfers to you through object they touched? That antique mirror, what faces has it reflected? What secrets might it preserve? The stones of old buildings, what have they witnessed? What memories are trapped in their substance? Modern materialism treats objects as dead things, commodities to be bought and sold without consequence. But our ancestors knew better. They understood that things accumulate history, that ownership creates obligation, that some artifacts carry weight that cannot be measured in currency or insured against loss. The cursed relics of the world teach us to approach the material realm with respect rather than presumption, to recognize that we are not masters of things but temporary custodians. That possession comes with responsibilities extending beyond our own lifetimes into futures we cannot see. That the most dangerous objects are often the most beautiful. That the deepest truths often come wrapped in terror. And that sometimes the only way to move forward is to acknowledge the weight we carry from the past. If these explorations have resonated with you, subscribe to this channel for more journeys into humanity's darker heritage. Comment below with which relic spoke to you most deeply. Which curse would you dare to risk? Which prophecy would you heed? Share this with those who understand that the most dangerous objects are often the most beautiful, that the deepest truths come wrapped in terror, and that sometimes the only way to move forward is to acknowledge the weight we carry from the past. The cursed relics remain in their places: museums, private collections, bank vaults, buried earth. They continue their eternal witness, their supernatural vigil, their refusal to let us forget. And somewhere in the darkness of winter, they wait for those who still have ears to hear what objects remember when humans prefer to forget. Sleep well, dear listeners. And remember that the objects around you are watching, listening, absorbing everything you do. Treat them well. Treat each other better. For someday, long after you are gone, those objects may still be here, telling your story to future generations who will judge you not by your intentions, but by the consequences that echo through the things you touched. Good night, and may the relics you encounter in life be blessed rather than cursed, protective rather than vengeful, testaments to joy rather than monuments to horror. I am Mr. Ravenhurst, and this is the world's cursed relics, 7 artifacts that refuse to be forgotten.